Before Fallout became one of the most iconic post-apocalyptic franchises of all time, there was a single document that tied every answer to everything, and it's called the Fallout Bible. Written by Chris Avellone, one of the original creators behind the early Fallout games, this massive collection of Q&As was released in 2002 after Fallout 2 and Fallout Tactics on the Black Isle Studios website as a way to answer fan questions and to clarify deeper lore of the series. But what started out as something as simple as a Q&A quickly turned into something much bigger. Hidden within the pages are the original intentions behind the Fallout universe. Early ideas, cut content, forgotten lore, and explanations that completely change how we understand the world of Fallout. Now, officially, the Fallout Bible isn't considered canon, and if you follow this channel long enough, you know I love talking about Fallout canon. But over the years, Bethesda Game Studios has pulled ideas directly from it, bringing parts of these writings into the modern Fallout lore, which raises the interesting question: if parts of the Fallout Bible keep becoming canon, was it ever really non-canon to begin with? Today we're going to find out, because I've gone through the entire document, all 250 plus pages of it, archived thanks to the incredible community over at No Mutants Allowed. And in this video we're going to be diving into everything, from the original direction of the Fallout universe, to the obscure lore details most fans never even heard of, to the ideas that may still shape the future of the series. So whether you're here to learn something new, or just want something interesting to fall asleep to, sit back, because this is going to be the complete dive into the Fallout Bible. The first entry of the Fallout Bible was posted on January 15th of 2002 by Chris Avellone, one of the designers behind Fallout 2. And although it wasn't originally published on the Black Isle Studios website and was actually on a fan site, we'll go back into that detail in a short bit, the goal wasn't to create some massive lore document. It was actually meant to help consolidate information for Fallout Van Buren, the original version of Fallout 3 that was in development. And if that game sounds interesting to you, I'm actually working on a full deep dive covering everything about Fallout Van Buren. And if you wanted to learn more about what could have been the Fallout 3 that was canceled, definitely stick around on the channel for that and subscribe if you want to do that. But anyway, over the course of 2002, Avellone released a total of 9 entries, all spread out over 11 months. But in a very Fallout fashion twist, there is something called Entry 0, which was later released to correct the statements from the original 3 Q&As. So right away, before this thing even fully takes shape, it's already going back and fixing itself, which honestly just feels pretty on brand for how Fallout lore tends to work. What is also really interesting is the term Fallout Bible. It didn't even exist when they were first beginning to release these documents or Q&As. The name actually came later on when a community veteran, Dan Wood, came up with this idea, because originally they were just simple posts answering fan questions. In fact, Chris Avellone himself wasn't a fan of the term Bible early on, because it made the whole thing sound way more official than it ever was meant to be. From his perspective, this wasn't supposed to be a definite, unquestionable source of canon. It was just extra source material for fans who wanted to learn more about the world in the background. Now, obviously the Fallout Bible is a massive document, and as tempting as it would be to go through every single line, there's just not really the goal here of this video. Instead, I'm going to be focusing on the most important parts, the ideas, the lore details, and cut content that either reshaped how we understand the Fallout universe or connected into surprising ways in future versions of Fallout in the canon we have today. So with that, let's start right at the beginning and take a look of where this document and journey really begins. And that is with Section 0. Now, yes, that's not a mistake. Section 0 is actually the combination of what was originally Sections 1 through 3, written between January 15th and February 25th of 2002 by Chris Avellone. Before this was all neatly compiled together, these entries were originally scattered through different Fallout fan websites, which is kind of a wild thing to think about. You know, just the idea of having a developer of one of your fan favorite games posting on your website Q&As is absolutely crazy and definitely talks about the time. Eventually, Section 0 and everything from Section 4 onward would be hosted on the Interplay website, giving it a more official home. But again, that whole idea of, like, can you imagine having a modern AAA developer answering lore Q&A questions on a random, like, Reddit? It just, and making it semi-canon, especially at the time, it's just chaotic, and it's perfectly Fallout, and it just shows how much the developers had love, and this was more definitely of a passion project versus like a money-grabbing thing. So let's get into the more interesting things from this section, starting with something that is pretty much defines the entire series of Fallout, and that is the FEV. The Forced Evolutionary Virus, or FEV, is described in both the original games and the Fallout Bible as causing widespread sterility in creatures it mutates, especially in humans. This is what leads to the creation of supermutants, and is one of the key reasons their populations can't grow naturally. The Bible also touches on ghouls in this context, which is where things start to get a bit messy. There are some implications early on that the FEV might be connected, but the general consensus, both then and now, is that ghouls are primarily the result of extreme radiation exposure, not the virus itself. But early on, I believe it was the two Chris's literally was clashing about what caused ghouls. One of them believed it was the FEV, combination of the FEV and radiation. And I believe it's Tim Kaine who made it clear that he was like, no, it's just radiation. And that's what it was. But I know early on it was a debate, and it was made more evident within the Fallout Bible that ghouls are made ghouls by radiation alone. So even here, right at the start, we can already see the Fallout Bible sometimes blur lines between clearly defining what is canon and, you know, what is, and we'll get into more examples of this later on, but there's just a lot of interesting things that go on through the Fallout Bible. What is interesting thing is not everything is affected by the FEV becomes sterile, at least early on. Certain species seem to bypass this limitation entirely, most notable creatures like rats, mantises, red scorpions, and even deathclaws. And that raises some pretty big questions about how the FEV actually works, depending on the host. Because if some creatures can still reproduce, then the long-term impact of the FEV on the wasteland becomes a lot more unpredictable than it first seems. And then we get into one of the more weirder and honestly overlooked creatures in the Fallout lore, the Wanamingos. According to the Fallout Bible, Wanamingos aren't aliens, despite how they might look in the original Fallout. Instead, they're a result of FEV experimentation. They're engineered creatures, most likely created before the war as a biological weapon, which makes them way more interesting than just a random cave monster. But it gets a bit darker. By the time of Fallout 2, they're already on the brink of extinction. Avellone straight up states that Wanamingos are essentially a dying species. The queen from the original game is dead, and the eggs you find in Fallout 2, that's it. That's the last of the generation, the last of the Wanamingos. The young won't survive more than a few years after the events of the game, and the remaining adults will die off soon, even sooner than that. Meaning that without intervention, Wanamingos are completely gone from the wasteland not long after the end of Fallout 2, which is a kind of a crazy thing to think about, because it means one of the most unique creatures in the series basically is only a temporarily footnote in the timeline, a pre-war experimentation that showed up, caused chaos, and then just disappeared forever. The next part of Section 0 is where things start to get a bit more questionable, and honestly kind of controversial. You'll see as we look in the Fallout lore as we understand it today. In the Fallout Bible, Chris Avellone goes on a number of creatures from the wasteland that are supposedly infected or influenced by the Forced Evolutionary Virus, and we're not just talking about a few outliers here. He's listing things like geckos, rats, mantises, Brahmin, scorpions, ants, and even mutated plants like the Venus flytrap plants we see in Fallout 2. Which, if you stop thinking about it for a second, it kind of is insane, because what he's essentially saying is that a huge portion of the creatures we see in Fallout and Fallout 2, they didn't just mutate from radiation alone, but were shaped in at least part by the FEV. And that's kind of where things start to fall apart a little, at least in my mind, because if this was fully true, it would mean the FEV had an absolute massive widespread impact across the entire wasteland, far beyond what we see in the games. I mean, sure, we see There's sources of FEV like the vats in the West Coast that we see in the original Fallout, or even locations like Vault 87 out of DC. But the idea that all Brahmin rad scorpions across the country are the result of FEV exposure, that doesn't really hold up in my eyes. Inconsistent way of explanation. Like it's just a way that people just throw away a reason why there's these weird creatures, and just a catch-all for why everything is weird. And honestly, this is where the FEV kind of becomes a problem in early Fallout lore. It almost becomes too useful as an explanation, because on one hand you have radiation clearly creating things like ghouls and human twists that almost become unrecognizable. And on the other hand, you got FEV creating supermutants and other extreme mutations. But when you start blending those lines, saying maybe that this creature is FEV and maybe that one is radiation, maybe it's both, it kind of gets a bit messy. Like, if radiation can turn humans into ghouls, is it really that much of a stretch to say it could also mutate animals into rad scorpions or Brahmins? At a certain point, I feel like even the lore itself isn't entirely sure on where to draw the line, even with more recent Fallout games trying to clear things up. So yeah, it's kind of unclear, and I know I'm kind of just ranting on about FEV and whatnot, and I promise this whole video isn't me just ranting about these things, and this is probably just it in the very beginning. But yeah, it's kind of like a catch-22 of what everything is. It's just like, oh, it's FEV. And although, he talks about how, I'll give an example. For example, rad scorpions, they can still breed, so it doesn't cause them to be sterile. So technically, I guess you could say FEV caused rad scorpions, and they just breeded so much that they're found all throughout the world. And I guess, in theory, it could work out, but that's just a lot. And that's just a lot in my mind. Now, shifting away from mutated creatures into something that is more Fallout fans love talking about, this is where the Fallout Bible drops one of the biggest lore confirmations of all time. According to the Bible, vaults were never meant to save the population of the United States, and that's a huge deal because by 2077, the US population in Fallout was sitting nearly 400 million people, about 500 million more people than it is today. And there was never enough space, never enough resources, and never an intention to try to have the vaults save the entire population of the US. And, if you go back and play the original Fallout game, that's not made entirely clear. Like, Vault-Tec as a corporation wasn't evil by any sense, really. That was only shown more in, like, Fallout 2 when you have more experiments going on where it started becoming more clear. I mean, of course, you had Necropolis and the Bakersfield Vault told about in the original Fallout, but like none of that was like super clear that that they were experiments, right? It's spelled out very clearly in Fallout 2 and then in the Fallout Bible. The real purpose of the vaults were experimentation, and they were designed to study pre-selected groups of people and observe how they would react to extreme conditions, things like isolation, scarcity, social imbalance. And from there, they would see how successfully they could rebuild society once the vaults opened. In other words, Vault-Tec wasn't trying to save humanity. They were trying to run tests on it, especially during the period of Fallout, right? And the Fallout Bible goes into then list a number of these experiments, some of which we see in games later on, and others that were just ideas that were just left in the Fallout Bible. If you've seen my video covering every Fallout vault, I've talked about all these before and how awesome it is that we see some of these vaults later on in later Fallout entries or reference to them. And it's just so cool. And that's another reason that some parts of the Fallout Bible is like still canon. And, by that quote by Emil Patrigo that I put at the beginning of this video, they pick and choose what they want is canon, which is just, it's really interesting to me of like what is what. For example, Vault 8 was a control vault, meaning no experiment would happen at all. It was designed to open up 10 years and successfully recolonize the surface, which eventually led to the creation of Vault City in Fallout 2. Then you have Vault 12, where the door was initially designed to not close properly, exposing its inhabitants to radiation. And the result was, of course, the ghouls of Necropolis from the original Fallout. Vault 13 was meant to stay sealed for 200 years as a long-term isolation study, but of course things didn't go exactly as planned. The water trip failed, and then that kicked off the story of the original game. And then there's Vault 15, which was packed with people of radically different ideologies, basically designed to see what would happen if you forced people with completely different opposing worldviews into a confined space. And then you start getting into the vaults that were never originally shown in the games, and this is where the things start, getting really interesting, because these were like vault experiments that were just thrown in on this like Q&A entry and wasn't told anything else, right? We have Vault 27 that was overcrowded on purpose with double the population it could sustain. Vault 29, which only allowed children under the age of 15 inside, separating them from their parents entirely. Vault 34 that was stocked with weapons that had no locks on the armory. Vault 36 forced its residents to survive on nothing but a thin, watery gruel. We had Vault 42 limited to dimming all the lights to like a low wattage valve. Vault 53, which was designed that the equipment would constantly break down and just cause more stress to the vault dwellers. And then you have the really bizarre ones like Vault 55 that had all forms of entertainment removed. Vault 56 that did the opposite but only had tapes from one particularly bad comedic actor. And then it noted that sociologists apparently predicted that Vault 55 would fail faster, which raised a lot of questions just how important entertainment really is. But I digress. Vault 68 and 69, which were exactly as uncomfortable as they sound. And you most likely have heard of these experiments, which had one single woman among 1,000 men, and the other with a single man among 1,000 women. Vault 70 had jumpsuits that would fail after 6 months and would destroy itself. And Vault 106, which introduced psychoactive drugs into the air within just 10 days after sealing, which we would later get to see firsthand in later games. And all of these ties into one of the most important numbers revealed in the Fallout Bible, and that there were 122 vaults in total. Again, this number wasn't told necessarily anywhere else beforehand. This is the first time we are told the total amount of vaults we have. All this new stuff at the time was completely new and original to the Fallout, the whole number. Later we would get it more confirmation by Bethesda and Fallout 3 and later entries. Moving on, another really cool thing that was buried in the Fallout Bible, and something that I generally didn't expect to find, are cut ending slides for characters and allies from Fallout 2. Now, if you already played the game, you already know about the ending slides narrated by Ron Perlman, wrapping up the different storylines depending on your choices. But what's wild is that there were more of these written out. They just were never recorded. And because of that, they never made it into the final part of the game. So technically, these aren't canon, these next parts, but they give a really interesting look at what the developers were thinking these character features might be, and based on what is written and some of the characters that we actually do see in later entries, they actually line up pretty darn well. Take Harold, for example. In the cut ending, you hear about him long after the events of the game, and a tree start growing out of his head that apparently has gotten even larger, much larger, and that there are rumors that it even started bearing fruit with seeds strong enough to take root in the most barren parts of the wasteland. And what's crazy is this actually lines up pretty darn well with what we see in Fallout 3, where Harold is fully become part of a massive tree. So even though this ending never made it into Fallout 2, the idea clearly stuck around in some form, because that is 100% what we see of Harold in Fallout 3. And then there's Marcus, one of the most memorable companions in Fallout 2. His cut ending states that he was inspired by the Chosen One, and he traveled out east across the mountains to search for other remnants of the Master's army, and was never seen from again. Now, that's not exactly what ends up happening in canon, right? He's never seen from again, and, he just wanders out east. In Fallout New Vegas, Marcus is still very much around, having gathered a super mutant refugees and established Jacobstown. So while the disappear forever part clearly didn't stick, the core idea of him seeking out and helping more of his kind and bringing them closer together of Master's remnants is still very clear in the mind of Marcus. And then you also get smaller, more grounded epilogues like that of Lynette from Vault City, who steps down from power and ends up influencing relations with the NCR, or Dick Richardson, whose legacy basically gets erased to the point where the term president becomes more of a boogeyman than an actual title. And then there's the Elder Arroyo, whose ending leans fully into the ending you never expect of a Fallout character, and that is her actually passing away peacefully and joining the Vault Dweller in some kind of spiritual afterlife, it's said. It's very different vibe compared to the usual bleakness, and honestly, it works and I love it. Moving on, another small but really neat detail in the Fallout Bible is something only players of the original game will fully appreciate. If you remember those talking head characters with the text input boxes where you could type in a keyword and get more information, the Bible actually lists what you're supposed to type in to unlock additional dialogue. I don't know if it's a fully complete list. I think Avellone makes that it's a big enough, like, it has enough things that he considers it like more or less a complete list, but there might be some things he's missing. And it's kind of one of those behind the scenes things, especially at the time, that you, like, players don't know and they couldn't necessarily just Google and have all the answers appear for you. So having this full list at the time was absolutely huge because, I mean, there was, realistically speaking, no other way for players to figure out how or what they were supposed to type in without actually doing the task. Hey there, so obviously I'm not big enough to be sponsored or anything yet, but these videos do take a lot of time to do so, and I am a Bethesda ambassador, meaning if you want to buy anything like the Elder Scrolls or Fallout related merch, use my code and link down below, and you will save instantly 20% off, but you'll also be supporting me as I get a little kickback of a bit of a commission from that. So there are a few different things that you can do, a few different items you can get. You can get official Bethesda merch, such as clothing, items, and whatnot. There's actually a lot of really cool things. And so if you're interested in getting anything Bethesda related, use my code down below. You get 20% off. If it doesn't work, just message on that pinned code that's in the comments, and I will send a new one. But thanks again, and enjoy the video. Now, getting into something a little stranger and my personal favorite thing that is in the Bible and Fallout lore is the Psychers. In the Fallout Bible, we get a little bit more detailed explanations about the psychic characters found in Master's Lair. Characters like Wiggum, Lucy, and Moore, and Gideon are all described with specific abilities like electrokinesis, telekinesis, pyrokinesis, and even forms of telepathy. And according to Chris Avellone, these abilities were most likely the results of FEV experimentation, with the Master somehow unlocking their latent psychic potential in certain individuals. But here's the thing, most of these experiments did not go well, like at all. A lot of them resulted in insanity or outright failure, which is very on brand for anything involving the FEV. And because of that, when the cathedral destroyed at the end of Fallout, Psychers were essentially wiped out entirely, gone, and removed from the setting. Chris makes it very clear he doesn't really like Psychers in the game, and he makes it clear that they were all dead or destroyed by the end of the original Fallout. I am a little upset, and I'll go back into this later on, that no one asked any questions about Psychers. Like, this is probably the only opportunity we have ever gotten or will ever really get about what these were, what these meant, like all these different abilities, because it's just kind of a throwaway thing that you get at the very end of the game, right? Psychers, because there's nothing else is really mentioned about them until this ending, and this is it. Like the Fallout had a whole basically magic system, and all we know is basically some dialogue options you get at the ending of Fallout, and this very small entry in the Fallout Bible, because we don't get many other questions other than that. And finally, one of the biggest and honestly most useful sections in the Fallout Bible is the complete timeline, at least at the point of Fallout 2. Now, I do want to give this a bit of a disclaimer here, because even with the Fallout Bible itself, the timeline isn't perfect. There are multiple inconsistencies, and even Avellone goes back later on in later entries and corrects certain entries. So what I've done is I've tried to piece together the most accurate version possible based on those corrections. But just know that this is one area in the Fallout lore where it gets a bit shaky depending on its source. And that being said, it's incredibly valuable, but I have attempted to redo everything, but it's possible I might have missed one or two things because I know he went back in later entries and corrected everything. So I tried my best to paste everything together, but here is the entire Fallout timeline according to the Fallout Bible. So this was canon for at least quite a while, and some of these things are still very much true to this day, especially later on as we start getting to the later entries. But let me just read through this and we can dissect this as we go through it, because this is one of the coolest things of the Fallout Bible. 2051. Seeking to protect business interests and their oil supply, the United States began to exert increasing pressure on Mexico, citing the political instability and pollution stemming from Mexico as a threat to the United States. Various economic sanctions serve to destabilize Mexico, and the United States military enters Mexico to keep the oil refineries running and making sure oil and fuel continue to make their way north across the border at Mexico's expense. 2052. A television documentary into the weathered husk of the Texas oil field brings the oil shortage into American households and reveals how deep the energy crisis runs. 2052 April. The resource wars begin. Many smaller nations go bankrupt, and Europe, dependent on oil imports from the Middle East, responds to the Middle East's rising oil prices with military action. The long drawn-out war between European Commonwealth and Middle East begins. 2052 May and July. The United Nations, already suffering, begins to collapse. In a series of heated debates, many nations withdraw from the organization as the UN tries to keep at peace. At the end of July, the United Nations is disbanded. 2053. The socially transmitted new plague arises, killing tens of thousands. The United States closes its borders, and the first ever nation quarantine is declared. The source of the plague is unknown, but rumors persist it is a genetically engineered weapon. Like an exclamation point at the end of a very bad year, a terrorist nuclear weapon destroys Tel Aviv. 2054 January. Limited nuclear exchange in the Middle East rises fears throughout the world. 2054. In light of the Euro-Middle Eastern conflict and the plague scares, the United States sets up Project Safe House in motion. The project, financed by junk bonds, is designed to create shelters called vaults for the populace in the event of a nuclear war or deadly plague. Construction begins in late 2054 and proceeds rapidly due to the advances of construction technology. 2054. Zax 1.0 goes live, developed by Vault-Tec initially as a prototype of some of the systems designed to govern the vaults. It is given to the government to help the Department of Energy collect resource data. Within a year, it is taken by the military for a plague and tactical research. One version, Zax 1.2, is constructed for West Tech. 2055. The West Tech Research Facility starts working on a new virus to kill the new plague. Their viral research and close ties to the federal government eventually led them to being chosen for the Pan-Immunity Verizon project 20 years later, as well as the Power Infantry Armor and Research Project. 2055. Zax 1.2 is brought in to regulate the conditions in West Tech. It is not part of the Vault-Tec preservation software, so it does not have any orders to protect the humanity after the bombs fall. In the meantime, it calmly calculates data and plays chess with the scientists. Many scientists claim that Zax is a big old cheater and draws the game out too much for the computer of his considerable abilities. 2059. The Anchorage front line is established. The United States increases its military presence in Alaska to protect the oil interests. The Anchorage front line causes tension in the United States and Canada as the United States attempts to pressure Canada into allowing American military units to guard the Alaskan pipeline. 2059. The first artificial intelligence is born. Limited by memory constraints, its expansion is rapidly halted. The discovery paves the way for future AI research in laboratories throughout the United States. 2060. Traffic on the streets of the world stops moving. Fuel becomes too precious to waste on automobiles, so alternative exploits like electric and fusion cars begin to be manufactured, but factories can only make limited amounts. Pressure on fusion research increases. 2060. The Euro-Middle Eastern War ends and the oil fields in the Middle East run dry. There is no longer a good goal to the conflict, and both sides are reduced to almost ruin. 2062. Despite quarantine measures, the new plague continues to spread, fueling national paranoia. 2063 August. The construction of most vaults completed except for Vault 13, whose construction finally gets off the ground, hurting to a development cycle that seems plagued with problems. Drills begin in other cities with completed vaults, but the increasing frequency of drills become a cry wolf effect, and the turnouts for drills trickle off as the years go on. 2065 June. Due to the enormous demands of electricity in the summer of 2065, a nuclear reactor in New York City almost goes critical. The near meltdown brings into effect power rationing, and the term hot summer is used to refer to the New York incident. 2065 August. Increasing need for mobility in the United States mechanized cavalry leads to military focus on efforts to increase a man-based tank, essentially a two-legged walking unit, power armor. Power armor research grows and several prototypes are developed, many of which prove to be unworkable in the field. These prototypes pave the way for future advances in military, construction, and fusion technology. 2066 Spring. As the oil supplies dry up across the globe, China's fossil fuel dependency causes an energy crisis in the nation. China, bordering on collapse, becomes more aggressive in trade talks with the United States. Unwilling to export oil to China, talks between the United States and China break down. 2066 Summer. Adding further insult to the Chinese-American relations, the first crude fusion cell is unveiled, one of the results of Power Armor project. Devices designed for fusion cells begin to be manufactured. Incorporating fusion power into the general U.S. infrastructure begins, but the process is too slow for the power supply to the regions that need it. Nearly 13 years later, few sections of the United States are supplied with fusion power. 2066 Winter. In the winter of 2066, China invades Alaska. The Anchorage front lines becomes a true battlefield. 2066 Winter. As a sign of increasing tension between the two countries, Canada proves reluctant to allow the American troops on Canadian soil to allow American planes to fly over Canadian airspace. The United States and Canadian tensions rise, but Canada eventually backs down, and the U.S. troops pass through Canada. This sets the stage for the Canada annexation in 2076. 2067. The first suit of power armor is deployed in Alaska. While lacking the full mobility of future versions, this power armor is increasingly effective against the Chinese tanks and infantry. This ability to carry heavy ordnance becomes key in the various localized conflicts, and has the power to destroy entire towns without endangering the wearer. China rushes to create their own versions, but they are many years behind the United States. 2069. Canada begins to feel the pressure from the United States military as the U.S. draws upon the Canadian resources for the war effort. Vast stretches of timberland are destroyed, and many resources in Canada are stretched to the breaking point. Many Americans refer to Canada as Little America, and Canadian protests are unheard. 2069 March. Vault 13 finally completed as one of the last vaults, and drills begin. Due to its late completion, the cry wolf effect that hurt the other vaults is not as pronounced. 2070. The first of the Chrysler's motor fusion-driven cars are developed. Reassuringly big and American, the limited models carry a hefty price tag but are sold out within days. Many Chrysler's plans have been long converted into making military ordnance. 2072. The United States' increasing demands of Canadian resources causes protests and riots in several Canadian cities. An attempted sabotage attempt of the Alaskan pipeline is all the military needs as an excuse to begin its annexation of Canada, which in fact already began in 2067. 2073 September. As China becomes increasingly aggressive with their use of biological weapons, the United States government felt that it needed a countermeasure. The Pan Immunity Verizon Project, or PVP, is officially formed, and plans are made to begin experiments in West Tech Research Facility in Southern California. 2074. Contrary to their claims of seeking only to retake Alaska from the Reds, American power armor units, infantry, and mechanized divisions are deployed to China, but they become bogged down by the mainland of putting on further drain of American resources and supply lines. 2075, March 21st. PvP experiments continue at West Tech with a batch of 10011 as the wake of successful tests and the virus of single-cell organisms. Experiments on plant cells are postponed. The Pan Immunity Verizon is renamed to FEV, the Forced Evolutionary Virus. 2075, May 9th. The FEV experiments continue at Mariposa with a batch 10011 in the wake of successful tests on flatworms. The flatworms exhibit increase in size and heightened resistance to viral contagions. The experiments with insects have less success, and further experimentations on insects are postponed by Major Barnett. 2075, June 30th. FEV experiments continue at Mariposa with batch 10011, while white mice as subjects. Increased size, muscle density, and intelligence is noted. 2075, November 9th. FEV experimentation batch 01011 on rabbits is concluded. Increased size, intelligence, and this time aggressiveness is noted. Apparently it was hard to determine whether the flatworms on the previous experiments were angrier and more violent than normal. Frankly, the researchers cannot be blamed for this. 2076, January 3rd. A military team under the command of General Spinyard is sent to West Tech Research Facility to monitor the experiments in the interest of national security. Captain Roger Maxson, the grandfather of John Maxson, the High Elder of the Brotherhood of Steel in Fallout 1, is among the team personnel. 2076, January 12th. Splicing several new gene sequences into their test virus, dogs are injected with batch 11101 at Mariposa. Although increased strength was noted, increased intelligence was not. 2076, January. The United States annexation of Canada is complete. Canadian protesters and rioters are shot on sight, and the Alaskan pipeline swarm with American military units. Pictures of the atrocities make their way to the United States, causing further unrest and protests. 2076, January 26. Using batch 11011, experiments are conducted on raccoons. Same results as noted, but the attempted escape of several infected raccoons causes Major Barnett to terminate the escape and the test subjects. 2 pairs of raccoons, however, are unaccounted for. Note, Scott Campbell and Chris Taylor intended these escaped raccoons to form an intelligent animal community northwest of the globe called the Burrows. This location was never implemented. 2076, April 15th. All dogs from batch 11101A FEV tests at Mariposa are terminated from a safe distance. 2076, June. Power Armor prototype complete, resulting in Power Armor players find in Fallout 1. This is the pinnacle of Power Armor technology before the Great War. Many of these units are sent to China, and they begin to carve a swath through the Chinese forces. The Chinese resources are strained at the breaking point, and the supply lines from the nations China has been annexed began to break down. 2076, August. Food and energy riots begin in major cities throughout the United States. Military units begin to be deployed in cities within the United States to contain rioters, and many temporary jails are constructed. A state of emergency is declared, and martial law soon follows. 2076, October 4th. At West Tech, 15 champions are infected with batch 11111, the most successful test to date. Growth and immunities in the champions surpass all other subjects to date, and the military practically drools over the results. Plans are made in secret to begin testing in small quarantine towns in North America, and the Mariposa military base construction is sped up in anticipation of moving West Tech project to a location under military supervision. 2077, January 7th. Major Barnett orders transfer of all FEV research to the newly constructed Mariposa military base, despite objections from the research team. 2077, January 10th. Alaska is reclaimed, and the Anchorage front line is held again by the Americans. 2077, January 22nd. The first domestic use of Power Armor within the United States for crowd and quarantine control. Units originally serving in China and at Anchorage frontline find themselves fighting against Americans at home. Food riots increase, and many civilians are killed. Several soldiers defect from the military in both Canada and the United States. They are captured and sent to the military prisons. 2077, February. FEV research is leaked to the world through an unknown source. Protests in many major cities and governments from around the world, as well as accusations that the US was responsible for the new plague. FEV is seen as a threat that it is, and serves only as fuel tensions. 2077, March. Prepared for nuclear or biological attack from China, the President and the Enclave retreats to remote sections across the globe and make contingency plans for continuing the war. 2077, October. Captain Roger Maxson and his men discover that the scientists at Mariposa have been using military volunteers, aka military prisoners who didn't have their brains scooped out by brain robots, as test subjects in their experiments. Morale in their base breaks down, and Maxson executes Anderson, the chief scientist. Not long after this, Maxson's men turn to him for leadership. He shrugs and says, "We should quit." 2077, October 20th. Captain Roger Maxson, now in control of Mariposa, declares himself to be in full desertion from the army via radio, and nothing happens. Worried, Maxson orders all families stationed outside the base to be moved inside the facility. 2077, October 23rd. Great War. Bombs are launched. Who struck first is unknown, and it is not even known if the bombs came from China or America. Air raid sirens sound, but very few people go into vaults, thinking it is a false alarm. The vaults are sealed. 2077, October 23rd. Necropolis Vault, or Vault 12, never closes. Once it became known that the other vaults have sealed, people within Bakersfield attempt to force their way into Vault 12 to protect themselves and their families. 2077, October 23rd. The West Tech Research Facility is hit by warheads, breaking open the FEV tanks on levels 4 and 5, releasing it into the atmosphere. Once exposed to the radiation, it begins to mutate and infect humans and critters in the wasteland, dooming the player character in Fallout 1 and Fallout 2 to endure the hordes of random encounters. 2077, October 23rd. The Mariposa military base survives, the soldiers and scientists within protected from the radiation and FEV flooding the wasteland. 2077, October 25th. 2 days after, at Mariposa, a scout in power armor is sent out to get specific readings in the atmosphere. He reports no significant radiation in the area surrounding the facility. 2077, October 27th. After burying the scientists in the waste outside Mariposa, soldiers seal the military base, then head out to the desert taking supplies and weapon schematics with them. Captain Maxon leads his men and families to the government bunker at the Lost Hills. This event is called the Exodus, and the surviving soldiers went on to eventually form the Brotherhood of Steel. 2077, November. Captain Maxon, his men, and their families arrive at the Lost Hills bunker a few weeks later, suffering many casualties along the way, including Maxon's wife, but not his son. The Lost Hills bunker becomes the HQ of the Brotherhood of Steel the Vault Dweller finds in Fallout 1. 2080. The first effects of the virus are seen in the survivors. The widespread mutations occur with animals and humans alike. Those that survive the effects of the mutations are permanently changed by the virus. New species are created almost overnight. 2083 Summer. The city of Necropolis is formed by a ghoul survivor of Vault 12. 2084 Spring. Seth takes control of Necropolis, wresting control from the original overseer of Vault 12. Not willing to take a dirt nap, he is driven north and history loses sight of him. 2090. Vault 29 opens. Harold, now human, sets out to make his fortune as a trader, making the circuit around the survivalist commutes in the wasteland. 2091. Vault 8 opens, and they use their Gek to create a fertile ground for their city. This eventually becomes Vault City. 2092. LA Vault opens, and the Boneyard is founded and attracts survivors. 2092. Dr. Richard Monroe is exiled from Vault City for murder. The circumstances surrounding the murder are unknown, but he changes his last name to Gray and heads south. 2093. The hub is founded by a man named Angus, who sets up camp around a filthy oasis in the desert, and he proceeds to begin trading with other settlements. 2096. Harold rises to the level of caravan boss in the hub. His caravans suffer occasional attacks from the waste, but Harold's caravan outfit survives and prospers. Upon the mutated attacks begin to pick up within the next few years. 2097. John Maxon, the future High Elder of the Brotherhood of Steel in Fallout 1, is born. 2102, May 22nd. Increasing mutant attacks on Harold's caravan causes Harold to get so pissed he finances one of the first adventuring parties of Fallout and try to find out where the Dagnum mutants are coming from. Consulting with the scientist and a doctor at the hub, a man by the name of Gray, the two of them decide to join forces. 2102, June 23rd. Richard Gray's expedition, including Harold, finds a Mariposa military base, and the expedition is scattered to defeat the mutants of the base. Gray is knocked out into one of the vats of the FEV by a robotic arm, and Harold is knocked out unconscious, only to waken out later in the wasteland. 2102, June 27th. Harold, already mutating, is found by traders and taken back to the hub. His former caravan partners and employers, horrified by his condition, abandon him, and he is soon left out, even without two bottle caps to rub together. Horrified by his condition, abandon him, and he is soon left without two bottle caps to rub together. 2102, July. Richard Gray, now horribly mutated by the virus, crawls from vats covered with FEV and in terrible pain, barely able to think or perceive his surroundings. He crawls into a vat control room and begins his audio log. He fades in and out of consciousness, sometimes for weeks or days at a time. 2102, July to November. Richard Gray begins to acclaim to his condition and begins his first test of animals by exposing them to FEV. These experiments and his growing awareness laid the foundation for his plans for the Unity and the Master Race. He takes the name the Master. 2102, November. The first human victim wanders into Mariposa and Gray consumes him. 2102 December. Gray continues his experiments on wanderers that enter Mariposa, with no success. The creatures are flawed due to their radiation counts on their bodies, making them big but incredibly stupid. 2103 January. The Master discovers the problem with the influence of radiation on their mutations. He begins to choose their subjects more carefully. The first classic supermutants are born, butt-scratching animations and all. He begins his plans to build an army. 2103 to 2130. Throughout this period, the Master begins to slowly gathering test subjects, willing or unwilling, from local human stock. The Great Winter of 2130 and the scarcity of human subjects make building his army difficult. 2120. Angus rules over the growing hub and establishes himself as the governor. 2125 Winter. Angus is murdered and the hub is thrown into chaos. 2126. A band of merchants seizes the water tower in the hub. They demand anyone wanting water must pay a toll. The Great Merchant Wars have begun. 2126 to 2128. The Great Merchant Wars are fought, and the water merchants seal up the town, but are outnumbered by a man named Roy Green, Justin Green's grandfather, and makes peace and negotiates a settlement. The Hub Central Council is formed, composed of 2 representatives of each Hub's caravans companies. A long period of indecisiveness and meetings maintain the status quo in the Hub. 2130. The Great Winter occurs. 2131 to 2135. The Master begins ordering his supermutants to gather human stock from the caravans. Many years the caravan disappears and are blamed on monsters in the desert. Even when the abductions begin to occur in the Hub caravans, the Deathclaws are blamed. The supermutant army grows. 2134. A faction within the Brotherhood of Steel led by Sergeant Dennis Allen gains strength, and they urge the Elders to let them explore the southeast glow for artifacts. The Elders refuse, so Allen and his delusionist group splits away from the Brotherhood of Steel, taking some technology and weapons for them. 2134. Led by Sergeant Dennis Allen, a small team of Brotherhood of Steel head to West Tech's research facility in search of technological artifacts. They arrive there 20 days later and are promptly chewed apart by West Tech's unforgiving automated defense system. Wounded, Allen begins to suffer radiation poisoning from a leak in his suit. Before he dies, he logs what happened to the expedition into a holodisk and then goes to join the Brotherhood in the sky. 2135. Elder Roger Maxson dies of cancer. His son, already an accomplished soldier, takes up the role of general or elder within the Brotherhood of Steel. John Maxson becomes a member of the Paladins, showing tremendous promise as a soldier. 2137. The Master begins to mass-produce supermutants. Only about 1 in 6 or 1 in 5 attempts are successful, and of these successes, only half seems to go to be a part of the growing army called the Unity. 2140. Decker forms the underground in the hub and starts pulling strings. 2141. The Vault Dweller born. Raiders begin to form in a region as food supplies run low. The Khans and the Vipers begin terrorizing local settlements. 2142 Spring. Shady Sands is founded, walls erected, and against the Raiders. 2145. Cute little Tandy is born. Unaware of the time Fallout 2 rolls around, she will turn into a wizened old crone as hard on eyes. 2152. As their influences slowly spread throughout the waste, he demands their obedience as spies. Their leader, a man named Morpheus, pledges himself to the Master. Morpheus and the cultists form a future core of the Children of the Cathedral. 2155. John Maxson's father dies in a raid by the Vipers. Expecting the Raiders to break and run, Maxson doesn't take into account the religious ferocity of the Vipers, and when a single arrow nicks him with his helmet off, he dies within hours. John Maxson takes up the role as Elder, and Romulus becomes the new head of Paladins. 2155 to 2156. After capturing a caravan of strange-garbed travelers, Master learns the location of the Boneyard Vault, the future site of the cathedral. He concurs the inhabitants and sets up operations there, and the human cultists begin to use the vault as their power base. Within the vault, the Master learns of other vaults, and realizing their human occupants are ripe for transformation, and begins to send out patrols to vault locations in search of these other vaults. 2156. The Master sees advantages in establishing a beloved religion, the Children of the Cathedral, using them as spies in settlements throughout the wastes. Missionaries from the Children of the Cathedral spread slowly across the waste, acting as eyes and ears for Morpheus and the Master. 2157. The Master uses the location of Bakersfield Vault, Vault 12, and sends the detachment of supermutants there to seize the vault. Many ghouls are snapped like twigs in the attack, and Set finally parlays with the supermutants, telling them that the ghouls are the vault survivors and the supermutants are looking for. The supermutants, angered at failing to find an intact vault, set up a small garrison at the watershed to watch the inhabitants and insecure Set's cooperation in the wars to come. 2161 October. A Brotherhood of Steel patrol comes across a dead supermutant in the Badlands. They take the corpse back to the scribes, and head scribe Free begins her examination of the supermutant. 2161 December 5th. Fallout 1 begins. A Vault Dweller is kicked out of Vault 13 to find a replacement water chip. 2161 December 15th. Vault Dweller discovers Shady Sands, meets Tandy and Ian, who joins the Vault Dweller in searching for the water chip. 2167 December 30th. The Vault Dweller recruits Dogmeat in Junktown. 2162 January 17th. The Vault Dweller reaches the hub and negotiates with the water merchants to deliver water to Vault 13, buying the vault some time. 2162 February 13th. The Vault Dweller recovers the water chip in Necropolis. Ian is killed by a supermutant and reduced to a cinder, ending his tenacity to shoot the Vault Dweller in the back with the SMG burst. 2162 March 3rd. Vault Dweller kicks the Master's ass. 2162 April 20th. The Vault Dweller destroys the military base. Dogmeat dies defending his master. 2162 May 10th. Fallout 1 ends. The Vault Dweller returns to Vault 13 only to be told you're a hero and you have to leave. Some members of the Vault, led by Lydia, the head of the Return to the Service faction, include her supporters, Thessa and Thiel, follow soon afterwards. 2165 May 12th. The Vault Dweller removes his Vault suit, and from this day forward, he never wears it again. 2165 July 10th. The Vault Dweller heads north with a small group of Vault Dwellers and Wastelanders and founds the small village of Arroyo. 2167 August 18th. Construction of Arroyo completed. 2185 Summer. At high noon, Marcus and the Brotherhood of Steel Paladin Jacob cross paths many miles southwest of Broken Hills and punch and shoot at each other for a few days. Eventually, they give up, unable to take an advantage over each other. The two start traveling together and start arguing over the Master and the BOS doctrine, and whether or not the Master could truly narrow link his biology into the Cathedral computer network. 2185 Fall. Marcus and Jacob, along with a trail of humans, ghouls, and supermutants, found the community of Broken Hills. 2186 Spring. Jacob moves on and says goodbye to Marcus, and then moves on to parts unknown. 2186. The New California Republic is formed, and a central council is created for its governing body. 2188 October 2nd. The Vault Dweller has a daughter who becomes the Elder in Fallout 2. 2196. Tandy is unanimously elected president of the NCR by the NCR Council. As expected, she proceeds to do a kick-ass job. 2198. The Enclave works on various new technologies, including power armor variations. None of these are much of an improvement over the conventional old-school power armor, and some are actually worse. 2208, January 16th. After writing the Fallout 2 manual memoirs, the Vault Dweller vanishes from Arroyo and is presumed dead. The Vault Dweller leaves the Vault suit behind, folded on his bed. Some say the Vault Dweller was taken out by the Sky Spirits. Others say that the Vault Dweller felt it was time for him to move on and leave the Elders to guide the Arroyo to its destiny. 2208, February 2nd. The one moon cycle of mourning for the Vault Dweller ends, and activity in Arroyo begins to return to normal. 2208, February 2nd. Final training of the Vault Dweller's daughter for the sole role of Village Elder begins. She undergoes a great deal of physical training, tutoring in various sciences, mathematics, and courses of weapon skills. 2210, January 31st. Vault Dweller's daughter takes her a mystic test. A key ingredient is of which a several pots worth of hallucinogenic plants from Harkum's garden. She runs the gauntlet in the Temple of Trials, using her charm to pass most of the tests, and her handgun jams and is ruined on the first level. She offers numerous criticisms to the test, resulting in many revisions. 2210, February 2nd. The Vault Dweller's daughter ascends to the role of Village Elder. She rules for a steady hand, and her wisdom is greatly respected. 2211, Frank Horgan is born, unfortunately. 2215, August 1st. Congressman Richardson rises to power within the Enclave, aided by pressure from his father, President Richardson. 2215. Under presidential order, Enclave scientists begin working on an upgraded version of power armor. Many prototypes are developed and tested. 2220, March 5th. Congressman Richardson is elected president for the first term of 5, although aid and political pressure by his father, President Richardson. Enclave scientists develop a reliable version of the Mark II power armor. The prototype results in accidents, explosions, and deaths, and are classified by order of the President Richardson for the sake of morale. 2221, March 23rd. The Chosen One is born. The Chosen One's father is not recorded in the tribal records. The reason for this is unknown, but the elder may have simply been embarrassed. 2231, Melchior's son is born. 2235. The Enclave experiments on Deathclaws, attempting to create special fighting units to wage war on hostile environments. 2235. While there had already been a number of ghouls in Gecko at the time, more come to the area and the town of Gecko is formed. The new amount of ghouls brings scavenged technology, and the know-how and power plants becomes operational once again in Gecko. Vault City looks upon their new neighbor with growing concern. 2236, July to August. Enclave scientists and Chemical Corps scour the remains of Mariposa, while assault squads comb the desert for slaves they can use to mine the military base to get to the vats. One of the squads include a soldier, Frank Horgan, 25 at the time, recently removed from duty on the President's Secret Service to take some R&R time in the waste after some undocumented psychotic blunder or another. 2236. Melicor is captured by the Enclave Patrol and becomes part of the slave mining force in the military base. 2236, September. Enclave construction crews and supermutant slaves begin excavations. They uncover the FEV virus, and mutations begin to occur in the human workers. Frank Corrigan comes into contact with the FEV and is sent to the Enclave labs for study. 2236, October. Melicor begins to mutate, and he keeps his intelligence cunning in the wake of the transformation, making him pretty smart for a superhuman. Realizing that the Enclave will kill supermutants after they get to the FEV data, he begins to use his magician talents to secret away weapons for the mutants to defend themselves when the Enclave decides to dispense of them. 2237, January. Enclave, having obtained the FEV data, abandons the military base site after more mutations occur, causing the second generation super mutants to arise. The Enclave leaves a single squad behind to wipe out the super mutants. But the super mutants, using the arms they had already cached in the base during the excavation, reduced the squad to ashes after suffering heavy casualties. The remaining first and second generation supermutant slaves decide to remain in the base, and the group forms a new community. 2236 to 2238. Horgan gradually mutates from the exposure of the FEV. Gaining the physique and slow, stupid single-mindedness of a supermutant, he kept heavily sedated operation on and studied. He's conscious for only brief periods of time, then quickly sedated after the bloodshed is over. 2238. Harold arrives in Gecko, and with a lot of shaking of his head, he does his best to help with the ghouls in running the nuclear power plant. 2239, January 23rd. Tests begin to run dry on Frank Horgan. It is suggested that he might be used as a field operative, and he is used in tests in the wasteland against local populace. 2239, March 27th. Frank Horgan is manufactured for his new role. A new version of power armor is built to accommodate his mass, and he is sealed inside. After a few horrifically successful field tests, Horgan becomes the Enclave solution to numerous sticky problems. 2241. The worst dry season in many years causes a drought in the Northern California area, hurting crops and Brahmin in both Arroyo and Modoc. 2241, January. The first samples of jet begin arriving in Redding, courtesy of the Mondino family. 2241, February. Vault City rejects offers of an alliance with both the Bishop family of Dubrino and the NCR. 2241, March. Raiders' attack on caravans to Vault City begin. 2241, July 25th. Fallout 2 begins. The Chosen One begins his mystic test, descending into the Temple of Trials. 2241, January 27th. The Chosen One leaves Arroyo in search for the Gek. 2242, May 15th. The Enclave sends a coded sequence to Vault 13, anticipating the central computer and declaring what is time to leave for the Vault. Martin Forscher gathers the Vault's dwellers together in the tutorial movie. 2242, May 16th. Less than a day later, Vault 13 is opened, only to be greeted by 2 Enclave squads. The squads kill 3 of the citizens who were resisting capture and storm the Vault, kidnapping all the inhabitants. 2242, May 17th. Enclave animal handlers drop a Deathclaw unit into Vault 13 from a safe distance to kill anyone investigating the vault and to cloak the Enclave's presence. Other Deathclaws are sent into the desert surrounding Vault 13 to check for escapees or witnesses. 2242 Fallout 2 ends. The Chosen One enters the Enclave using the damaged tanker and destroys the Poseidon oil platform, killing the President and the United States and ending the Enclave's plans on world domination. Phew. So that was a lot of information to throw at you all at once. So let me break this down with, again, the most important information, aka what's most interesting to me at least. So I'll start off with the 2052 entry that a documentary is what shows the public how bad the resource wars, or I guess the crisis, is. And although it seems unimportant in the grand scheme of things, it just shows how much details and how alluded to this kind of information the public actually was about the state of the world compared to the government in the world of Fallout. The next entry I want to shed light on is in April of the same year, which is also interesting, that states that many smaller nations go bankrupt because of the energy conflict, and they eventually have to turn to military action in the Middle East, which is so interesting and yet so realistic, especially by, well, what's going on in today's standards. And of course, this would turn to be the downfall of the UN. This is widely known, as shown on a few different loading screens in Fallout 3. It's just a really interesting thing to see the progression of why this turned to this, because so many people forget about this war that basically caused the UN to collapse, essentially. And then let's move on to 2053, to which we have the new plague. That's something that is rarely talked about in the modern Fallouts. The idea that about 20 years before the Great War, the Fallout universe had a major plague killing tens of thousands of people, and the US actually closed its borders and enforced a quarantine similar to that of, realistically speaking, COVID in our timeline. And what's really interesting is the idea that it was engineered as a weapon, and it is very possible, even most likely I would say, that it was created by the US, and it was believed by other countries to be created by the US, especially with the FEV later on, and you'll see that in the timeline, right? And I personally think it's very possible, and I would say it's pretty likely that the US in this timeline created the new plague to do this and accidentally leaked it, or maybe not even accidentally leaked it. They just wanted to test it out, kind of thing, because they're one of the first countries to close its borders. So, say with that as you will. That is my thoughts on that. Moving on, we have a nuclear terrorist attack by the city of Tel Aviv in Israel, which destroys the city. One of the largest cities in the country of Israel is destroyed by a terrorist nuclear attack, which is absolutely crazy to think a terrorist group owned a nuclear weapon and was able to decimate a city. Again, it is different, especially compared to our timeline as of right now, but it does bring you the idea of with the idea of having more nuclear weapons, what could happen with that. And I don't want to go on this whole debate about nuclear weapons and whatnot, but it is really eye-opening, and the idea about it, something that I'd never thought about it. If a terrorist organization essentially got something like this, and eventually, with that happening and the war in the European war in the Middle East going on, this actually causes the U.S. to start Project Safe House, aka the construction of the vault. So it's between these two huge events is the main reason that we have Fallout. I'm skipping quite a few years ahead. I want to shine a light in 2063 in August with the idea of the Cry Wolf effect. The idea that pre-war vaults had lots of nuclear drills, so often so that people just stopped showing up when time came around, which is, again, really interesting, because the idea that most vaults, that brings up the idea that originally most vaults were not filled to their max capacity, meaning that most likely that estimated 120,000 occupants, which we know is already false, because we have some vaults which have less people, or more people depending on the experiment, right? But showing this, it's the Bible is, and the timeline is directly stating that Vault 13 is the only one that actually had all of its occupants show up on time. So that 120,000 quickly is probably slashed realistically and most likely in half by most people. And then moving on to one of the most interesting thing is the reason the FEV exists in the game is because it was America's response to China's aggressive use of biological weapons, which is crazy to me that it was originally just a way to go against someone, like just going the next step further that another country is like, okay, well, you have biological weapons, let's just create this horrible one. And it creates one of the base effects for the entire Fallout series, really. And it was actually originally called the Pan Immunity Variant Project, or PvP. And honestly, that's a pretty cool note. I don't know if that's actually in lore. It might be. Honestly, I don't know off the top of my head that information. Honestly, everything related to the FEV in this timeline is really cool. See them adding notes about how experiments went over and over the years, and seeing like what failed and what did, and like the intelligence rates of raccoons and whatnot. Like seeing those things, it's really cool. Speaking of the FEV, the whole backstory of Harold. If it wasn't already known, I honestly don't know if it's really shared that much in game. But the idea that Harold was a famous trader and one who made a lot of money, only to be thrown into the vats because he was looking for his missing caravans, or like a lot of his people went missing. So he just went on a mission to try to find what happened with them, and that's what ended up being his downfall, which is crazy to think about. That's something I didn't necessarily know, but I hadn't played the original Fallout in quite a few years, so it could be there just hidden behind dialogue with Harold. That's really cool. Another cool thing about that is the relationship between Morpheus and the Master, who, if you don't really read the terminals or really talk I don't even think Morpheus talks about it unless you convince him that you're work for the Master, that if you don't read terminal entries, you don't know that the relationship between them two, and how it's basically just I scratch your back, you scratch my back kind of thing, of he uses the children of the cathedral as a cover-up, and as spies on the mainland, which is it's a really cool relationship, and it works in each other's favors. And again, as someone who, the first time I played it, and before I did a lot more deep dives into the original game, I didn't necessarily know this stuff. I just walked upon this church and I was like, where's this Master's thing? I was so confused as to the connection between the two, but now I know about it. But it's really cool. Honestly, that's mainly it. I mean, the rest of it is mainly the timeline shown in the games, and in between the games, but there's nothing too profound within the two. Honestly, the most interesting things are pre-war, because again, that is not as explored as much as I would love to see it, and this timeline just absolutely goes super in depth, and it gives you so much detail, especially pre-war, about a lot of stuff. So it's really awesome. Again, take everything here on a grain of salt, because most of the stuff is considered probably non-canon, although, I mean, Bethesda just picks and chooses stuff whenever they don't have an idea of what to do for their thing, and they just pick something randomly from this timeline. So it's very well could be canon, but we just don't know it yet. So what exactly is Frank Horgan? Well, according to the Fallout Bible, the answer is actually a lot more unsettling than he's just a super mutant, because yes, Horgan is a mutant, heavily altered by the FEV, but the Bible makes it very clear that even before the transformation, something was already off with him. He wasn't just a soldier who got turned into a monster, he was in a lot of ways already heading in that direction. And what's really interesting is that Horgan himself never even considered that he was a mutant. The label mostly came from scientists within the Enclave, and even then they were very careful on how they described him. They called him an experiment, just not to his face. To the average Enclave soldier, Horgan wasn't some mutated human, he was basically just a weapon, a walking nuke, something the tech division built and unleashed when things needed to be handled decisively, and because of that, most soldiers didn't even fully understand what he was. They just knew he was dangerous, unstable, and not something you wanted to go anywhere near during the mission. And what makes this even more disturbing is how loyal he was. Horgan had one of the most absolute devotion towards the presidency, the Enclave, the military, and the structure as a whole, and that loyalty existed even before his exposure to the FEV. But after the transformation, it didn't just stay the same, it was reinforced, strengthening through conditioning, the testing programs, and what the Bible basically implies was a form of psychological manipulation. And because his intelligence was already low, and then the FEV further degraded him, he became the perfect test subject. Someone who wouldn't just question orders, someone who couldn't question orders, which, when you really think of it, makes Horgan less of a character and more of just a nuke with legs. Now moving on to Section 4, released in February 25th of 2002, this was where the Fallout Bible starts to get a bit more official, since this was the first ever fully published directly on the Black Isle Studios website, with all future entries from here going on there as well. And right away we get into some really interesting cut content from Fallout 2, including something that honestly sounds like it would have been super cool if it was in the final game. Originally, there were plans for a monastery-like faction, an independent group that was somewhat similar to our real-world version of the Jesuits. Their goal wasn't power or territory or technology in the traditional Fallout sense, it was about preservation. They wanted to collect books, blueprints, and pre-war knowledge and store it safely for the future. But the twist is, they didn't actually study it, or they didn't fully understand what they were preserving, they just worshipped it. They almost treated it like sacred relics or artifacts, and unlike the Brotherhood of Steel, who hoarded the technology to actively use it, the group would treat knowledge as something almost religious. And even more interesting, they were open to outsiders. Anyone could enter the Abbey. All this information wasn't locked behind ranks or initiation, which makes it feel like it's a really unique middle ground between preservation, religion, and post-war philosophy. And it's kind of a shame it never made it into the game, but I can understand why, because it is so similar to the Brotherhood of Steel. And it's definitely a direct contract to them. There's also another small detail in this section that ends up having some pretty big implications to what you might think. At one point, a question comes up as to why early supermutants in Fallout had slightly different variations in their designs, specifically things like their head sculpts, to which you see their straps underneath their lips. And on the surface, the answer is pretty simple. It just is a design variation by the artist. But there's one thing that stands out in this section, and that is, despite the general physical characteristics of a supermutant, variation can occur after FEV exposure. And that's where it gets interesting, at least in my opinion, because if you look at it, the earlier Fallout games, you do see a lot more variation, at least in the character models of the claymation parts. You got characters like the Master, Herald, and different supermutants that don't act or look the same at all, and those are all FEV related. Some are more intelligent, some are more stable, and others very much not so. Compare that to more modern Fallout titles, where you see supermutants tend to feel a bit more standard variations on themselves. They all tend to have a more or less a template. With a few exceptions, you have Fox, Strong, or Erickson, who show a more higher level of intelligence or different behavior, and thus having a little bit more variation. So this is one small note from the Bible that actually helps explain something that a lot of players probably never question, and that is why some supermutants are not different at all. And in fact, it's not just random, it comes down to the dipping process, I guess. The subject on how they were exposed to the FEV in the first place, how smart they were previously. And again, it brings us back to the same problem was, as we learn more about the FEV, the more complicated it gets, and the more it's just a fix-all to any questions you might have. But this is really interesting as to why there was that different levels of variation between supermutants and mutants from the FEV, and why you can see it later on, I guess. Next up, we got one of the most disturbing and honestly fascinating characters of all time, the Master. Most people already know that the Master is made up of multiple personalities, but the Fallout Bible takes that idea and pushes it further away than what you might be expecting. According to Chris Avellone, the Master didn't just physically absorb other beings after his exposure to the FEV, he absorbed their minds as well, their thoughts, their personalities, everything. And it didn't start with humans at first. One of the first things the Master absorbed was a rat shortly after emerging from the FEV vats at Mariposa, and he claims he could feel the rat's mind afterwards, which is just terrifying in concept when you really think about it, because it means the Master isn't just a collection of people, it's a collection of everything he's really consumed in that regard, layered together into one unstable consciousness. Now, let's talk about how he speaks, the voice, the iconic, almost distorted, multi-layered way he speaks. Well, according to the Bible, one of the individuals he absorbed had a Neuralink into the cathedral's computer systems, which allowed the Master to project his voice through it. So that robotic, echoing tune isn't just effect, it is literally a multi-systems personality speaking at once. And this is honestly one of the coolest like reasoning behind why we get it. Like, it's just the small little lore things that I really love about the Fallout Bible and like the Fallout series, and like this explaining why he has those different voices, those different personalities. This is how it happened of the Master. And the Master is arguably one of the best antagonists in the entire Fallout series, if not the best, and yeah, it's just really cool. Now, shifting gears a bit, this next detail is something that feels very relevant today, basically with newer Fallout content. And there's a lot of discussions recently, especially with the newer interpretations of the series, about the role of the Enclave and their connection to the Vaults. And what's really interesting is this wasn't a new idea, and I'm talking about specifically that the Enclave paid for and basically is the reason why the Vault did experiments and everything, and is most likely the benefactor that we see in Season 1 and Season 2 of the TV show. In fact, according to the Fallout Bible, this connection was actually intended from the very beginning, as early on as Fallout 2. The Enclave, being remnants of the pre-war US government, had direct access to Vault Tech's construction and systems, which makes sense when you really think about it. They funded the Vaults in the first place, but it goes even deeper than just funding. The Bible also explains that they had the ability to remotely monitor the Vaults, access the computer systems, read personal logs, and even track data through things like Pip-Boys, and in many cases, the early overseers were aware of this connection, and they were expected to compile and transmit data back to the government. And with this newest revelation, I guess, made in the Fallout TV show, this lines up directly to what was essentially the original intention of the Vaults, was that the connection with the Enclave, and everything was connected back, and they were speaking back and forth. So honestly, that is probably one of the most righteous, like, correct things the TV show has done, which is crazy to even think about. And when you look at this, the Vaults weren't just experiments run by Vault-Tec, they were also being observed by the Enclave the entire time, which honestly just makes the whole systems feel even more unsettling, because it means everything that happened inside the Vaults, every experiment, every failure, every collapse, was potentially being watched and recorded from the outside by some low-level Enclave tech. And what's even more interesting is that not everyone knew about these experiments or the connection to the Enclave. In fact, we see even high-ranking individuals like Lynette from Fallout 2 seem completely unaware of the bigger picture of the Enclave. Like, keep in mind, this vault that created Vault City later on was open pretty darn early on in terms of Fallout. I think it was literally like maybe 10 or 20 years after the bombs dropped that Vault City was created and the vault was open. So Lynette was, in all theory, I believe she was the only overseer, or she came into being the leader of Vault City. And for her to be completely unaware of this bigger picture, of the connection with the Enclave, is just crazy. Like, even if she wasn't, like, I could be wrong in this front. I'll be honest, I don't know this off the top of my head. But even if she doesn't, like, she would have access to all the overseer files and all that stuff. And for her not being aware, it's just crazy. In fact, if you even question her about certain inconsistencies of how the vaults know when to open, she doesn't have answers. And in fact, she gets defensive and she gets confused, which really sells the idea that even people in positions of power were really only told a piece of the truth. And honestly, once you realize the Enclave is basically the continuation of the pre-war government, the same entity that funded the vaults, everything just clicks. And reading this and like watching the TV show over again, like literally everything clicked. I'm like, oh, that makes so much sense. It makes the entire system feel a lot more intentional and a lot more controlled, but at the end somehow even darker. Moving on, another small but really interesting detail from this section is how companions work in Fallout 2. Most players know that companions get stronger as you level up, but the Fallout Bible actually breaks down the systems and how it works behind the scenes, and it turns out not all companions are created equal, and at least not all of them advance in the same levels. Characters like Gorus and Solek have up to 6 different advanced stages, scaling alongside the player and becoming specifically stronger over time. But then you have someone like Lenny, who only has 3 stages, mainly due to his age, which means mechanically he doesn't keep up as well in combat. It's one of those subtle design decisions that you might not notice during just a casual playthrough, but once you start looking at the nitty-gritty details, and the Bible like literally posts the screenshots of the different stages of it, something that you don't necessarily get access to as a player. You don't see the stats of your companions that early on. And once you notice these things, it kind of changes of how you look at companion choices entirely, and it's really cool. And finally, one last little detail that feels very Fallout in the best way possible that's in Section 4. There's actually a hidden interaction in New Reno involving a Brahmin. If you head to the stables, you might notice one that's acting a little bit off, mooing differently than others, and if you use your doctor skill on it, you will actually discover that the Brahmin swallowed a fusion cell, which is causing the distress. It's small and it's just a weird little moment, but it perfectly captures the mixture of the dark humor and the world building that Fallout is known for. Of course, if you fail the check too many times, the Brahmin will just get fed up with you and like attack you, but if you're able to succeed in the check, you're able to just get a fusion cell, which is, again, it's just a small little funny moment, but it's very Fallout-y. Section 5, which landed on March 11th, 2002, is where the Fallout Bible starts dropping some of the most fascinating and honestly most debated lore implications. A big focus here is on Gorus, who's already considered one of the most unique companions in Fallout 2, but the entry goes even deeper into something that completely changes how we understand Deathclaws as a species. According to the designer of John Dealey, the intelligent Deathclaw males carry a dominant intelligent trait, meaning if 2 intelligent Deathclaws like Gorus and Garn were to reproduce with non-intelligent female, there's a strong chance the offspring would still inherit intelligence. And that one detail is huge because it implies that intelligent Deathclaws aren't just a one-off anomaly in the series. Instead, they could actually be a surviving subspecies quietly continuing somewhere out in the wasteland. It opens up this idea as to somewhere, like in places like in California, there's just intelligent Deathclaws that might still exist in small pockets. Might honestly see them later on in the Fallout Prime TV show, if this is true. It completely separates the more common, feral variants that you might usually encounter, that of a Deathclaw, and having an intelligent one is just super cool. And while this was never fully confirmed in the final games, it does line up with how early developers originally envisioned them. And this is really cool, like the idea that it's possible that Bethesda brings it back, because although it's not really canon, this was the original intentions of it. Hey, this is Nick coming back from a later installment. Chris Avellone later contradicts this and says that this isn't true anymore. So, yeah, never mind this. Chris really hates intelligent Deathclaws. I'll go more into details about this later on, but sad face, because what I just said isn't true, and intelligent Deathclaws are dead, and he makes it very clear later on. From there, the Bible shifts back into one of its core pillars, the FEV, and how the different versions of it behave across the timeline. One of the most important distinctions made here is between the original pre-war West Tech FEV and the post-war variants used later on in the series. The Bible suggests that the earliest versions of the FEV, the pre-war versions, actually had the potential to increase the intelligence in certain subjects, something that we see reflected in characters like the Master, who becomes something far more beyond human in terms of intellect. But later versions of the FEV, aka post-war, are described as far less predictable. Instead of consistently enhancing intelligence, you can either increase it, it does nothing, or, most commonly, it is reduced significantly. This is reinforced through references like the Lieutenant, where exposure to the FEV is described as having wildly inconsistent effects. Some individuals become stronger or smarter, others lose cognitive functions entirely, and many remain largely unchanged. It also ties into the broader mutation outcomes where pre-existing conditions like radiation exposure can determine whether someone becomes a ghoul or a super mutant in the first place. The result is the system feels less like a fixed transformation and more, again, like the chaotic bio gamble every time the FEV is involved, because, again, it depends on your radiation exposure. It has so many other variables, and that's why, at least in an early game, there's so many variations to the FEV. Then we move on to something completely different, but just as interesting in terms of world building: vehicles, specifically the idea of functioning cars in the wasteland. The Fallout Bible obviously makes note that there's only one functioning car seen in the franchise, and that's the Highwayman found in Fallout 2, but when asked about the broader state of vehicles in the wasteland, Avellone estimates something along the lines of roughly one functioning car per 200 people, which is actually way higher than most people or most players would probably assume, given how rare we see vehicles found in game. But the reason is actually more practical than narrative. Mechanically, vehicles like cars or even mounts like horses are extremely difficult to implement in the original game engine without breaking pacing, balance, or world design. So their absence isn't necessarily lore-driven at first, it's actually technical limitation. That said, the Bible also hints that the vehicles do exist in a broader society. Places like New Reno even have things like chop shops that suggest that there are mechanics and infrastructure capable of maintaining cars, which implies that functioning vehicles are rare but not extinct. I mean, why would you have a chop shop, a legit location in the city, if it didn't do more business than just one car? And then there's the biggest implication buried in this section, and that's the idea that the New California Republic, or NCR, may have, at least at one point, maintained a vehicle division beyond simple farming equipment. While details are vague within the section, the very existence of such a division strongly suggests that the NCR had access to armored vehicles, possibly even tanks. It's one of those throwaway lore notes that are just made in the Bible that suddenly reframes the NCR as more, far more than industrial and militarized that the player might actually imagine for just gameplay alone. In other words, lore-wise, they are more ahead than what we actually see in game, which is pretty cool in my opinion. Also in this section, it takes a brief detour into an environmental lore, casually noting that penguins are extinct in the Fallout universe, while animals like elephants and hippos remain unknown or unconfirmed. It's a small detail, but it also reinforces as to just how drastically the pre-war world would have been altered and how much of Earth's biodiversity has either been lost or simply gone unrecorded after the war. There's also a mention of stranded U.S. military units being left in China after the war, another one of those lingering consequences of the Great War. This adds weight as to how global and unresolved the conflict really was, even decades later. This makes sense as to why we see, ex-Chinese military members in the U.S. in the games. We see them in the Shi, we see them in the submarine in Fallout 4, and Mao Chu in Fallout 76. I'm probably butchering that name. But yeah, we see multiple ex-Chinese or communist spies or military units. So it makes sense that in China, they would have the exact same thing, just U.S. people, which is, again, really interesting, and you don't think about it. And finally, in this section, we get a bit of an architectural lore tied to Fallout 2, and that is the Temple of Trials, one of the first major locations found in the game. It is confirmed to be built on top of a pre-war structure, most likely an old church. The carvings and decoration elements we see throughout the dungeon weren't entirely original either. Many of them were added later by the inhabitants of Arroyo, blending pre-war ruins with the post-world interpretation and culture. It's a small detail, but it's also very Fallout in spirit. We have the layers of civilization built on top of one another, each one misunderstanding and repurposing what came before. And honestly, I really do like this exclamation because I've always been so curious what this temple was, or like what it was supposed to be. Like, obviously, it was something of that's how it's here. So, seeing it's a church and how they made it to be that way, it makes more sense than to what my mind came up with, because I just had no idea. Section 6, dated July 10th, 2002, is the next section. And before we get into more of the lore and the Fallout Bible, I have to just read some of these comments that Chris Avellone makes in this document, because it takes it from making it feel far less like a formal document and more into just Chris Avellone kind of ranting and going on. He literally writes a message saluting someone named Sebastian, followed by a parenthetical note about posting answers on message boards, and then immediately follows it with completely unfiltered personal asides that go from like getting bounced of email addresses and screaming someone's name while having sex with his girlfriend. And then to top it off, there's another line where he basically just tells people that if he misspells their name, it's their problem for having too many vowels in it. To give you an exact quote, one of the lines is, "Sebastian, I salute you. Feel free to post your answers on the Fallout message boards." His other great claims to fame is the fact that I occasionally get bounced from his email address, which makes me mad and scream his name loudly, usually while I'm having sex with my girlfriend. And another quote is, "And if I ever get anyone's name wrong when I respond to your emails, tough. Some of you have A's and E's in strange places. Maybe if your parents had named you with someone with some sense, this wouldn't be a problem." It's chaotic and it's unfiltered, and I just absolutely love this. And this fully explains into more of what you're getting into once you read the Fallout Bible. And this is throughout the document. You can find like notes and marks about this, but this is just highlight of some of the parts, and I think it gets more chaotic in my opinion from section 6 onward. So keep an eye out for that if you're more interested in this. But this is the only time I'm really going to point it out, because this is just too hilarious. Pivoting from that, let's go into some cut content from Fallout 2, specifically one of the more interesting scrap locations involving the Shi. If you're not familiar, the Shi are a faction descendants of survivors that's tied to the Chinese submarine known as the Xing Hong Ti. Originally, they were supposed to have an entire playable segment involving the submarine beneath San Francisco. The idea is that it functioned as a dormant threat of an automated defense systems that would launch missiles at any American vessel that got too close to it. So part of the late game progression would involve you having to find a way to shut down this defense system, essentially deactivating it, so you could safely proceed to the oil rig tanker to effectively finish the sequence and continue this story from there. But ultimately, this entire sequence was cut largely due to the game's file size limitations and scope restraints, which is one of those classic Fallout 2 stories where you just get over ambition, and ultimately, this sheer size of the disc and the game itself realistically couldn't be handled once you add all this other stuff. From there, the Bible shifts into a really practical design explanation for something players have always questioning. Why do we never see random functional cars just in the wasteland or in the cities? Even though you can eventually build them and use the highwayman, why don't you see any other cars? And the answer is surprisingly simple, but also very revealing to how the game was designed. If the cars were just sitting around the world, it would completely undermine the entire questline of building one yourself. In a game where player freedom is extremely high, even allowing people to do things such as killing any NPC, including children in the original releases, having freely accessible vehicles would basically just break progression instantly. You wouldn't need to engage with the systems or quest or resource gathering that it would take to build this car, and the entire quest would just be forgotten. You just essentially just take some random one off the street or in the wasteland. So the absence is cars that you see throughout the game. It's not just a lore reason. There is no lore reason. It's just to make things balance, and it's to protect that progression through the game. We also get a small but interesting cut character detail involving Ian, one of the companions from the original Fallout. According to the Fallout Bible, Ian was originally planned to reappear in Fallout 2 as an elderly man found in the den. It's one of those subtle ideas that would have given the world a stronger sense into the long-term consequence of aging characters across the series, but ultimately he was cut mainly due to there were too many reoccurring characters from the original game, and they wanted to keep the cast feeling fresh rather than having to rely on callbacks to the original game. It actually is really interesting. Chris actually goes into more detail about what what would have happened with his interaction with Ian, and it would actually involve Ian mistaking you as the vault dweller from the original game, and he would ask you how you're doing, if you remember him, and all of the stuff you did. And if you just play along, you get to hear this entire story about what Ian has done and everything. It's actually like a really sweet and cool callback, but I understand why they didn't want to do it, but it's sad because actually in Fallout lore, in the prologue before Fallout 2, it said that Ian is killed. So, I guess that's what we get instead. Now, let's talk about this next section for Section 6. Honestly, it's one of the more interesting and deeper dives that's appeared in the entirety of the Fallout Bible, because it's going to dive into something that's, more than we've gotten before, and that is the idea of raiders. This section is going to go into dive into detail about the different raider factions and the structure behind it. This is literally the design documents, and Chris just posted everything that was the core idea behind how they worked. The biggest focus here is on the 3 original raider groups outlined by Chris Avellone. We have the Jackals, the Vipers, and the Khans. And what's interesting is all 3 of these groups were originally meant to exist in some form in the early Fallout, but only parts of that version actually survived into the final release and then later on in the series. The Jackals were described as the most straightforward of the 3. They were purely survival-driven, violent, opportunistic, extremely cautious. They don't attack unless they believe that they would, have the advantage. It makes them less about ideology and more just brutality, really. They operate in groups, they overwhelm their targets, and then retreat with any other spoils they can take. There's no deeper philosophy here. It's, basically them just surviving and looting and being essential raiders. The Vipers, on the other hand, are where things get really strange. They present themselves as followers of an ancient religion, emerging mostly at night, using stealth and poison as their primary tools. Their weapons of choice were bone knives and spears, dipped in pit viper venom that aren't just practical, they're ritualistic in nature. The victims they would take would be paralyzed by the poison and would often be taken alive. And just reinforcing the idea that they just aren't raiding, but it has that belief system behind it. And at the center of it all, their leader is Asp, who serves as a both ruler and high priest, adorned in bone armor and snake imagery, and reinforcing the group's most mythic identity. And we'll go into more detail about the Vipers, because Chris literally dumps this entire document that was ultimately cut because the Vipers aren't in Fallout 2, and I believe they make an appearance in Fallout New Vegas, but they're not what they originally were. And that's the thing that sucks, because the Vipers originally, as planned in Fallout 2, would have been so cool. And we'll get to this in a second, but first we'll discuss the Khans that were originally said. So they appeared to be mostly organized and ideologically driven. Of all the 3, they operate like a post-apocalyptic interpretation of a Mongol warband would, valuing strength above all else. They raid, they burn, they enslave, and constantly test themselves in combat, often preferring close-range melee fights as opposed to, far-back gun range. This proving that they have dominance. Firearms were even viewed as dishonorable or weak, which gives them a very distinct cultural identity compared to other raider groups. And what makes it even more interesting is how the groups interact with each other. We have layered hierarchy between the different factions. We have the Khans and Jackals disliking each other the most, while both still are just maintaining animosity towards the Vipers. laid out in the Fallout Bible is just shows the relationship between these three different raider groups is interesting. Note about the cons is obviously the cons we see in the original Fallout, they use guns. So the idea that firearms were viewed as dishonorable, that was the original intention, but from a gameplay perspective, that they're not it wouldn't be as strong for the player to face, so they gave him weapons to do that. So that was the original intention behind it. But now let's get into the Vipers, because we get an extensive background expansion here. It's almost kind of like a mini short story with all the details he has in it, and I'm not even explaining and going through every small detail, because there's so much more that Chris just explained, and there's so much more that, again, I highly recommend you watch this or read it. If you're like planning a Fallout tabletop RPG game or something like that, or hell, just want a really cool like raider faction, the Vipers that were originally written is a goldmine. Highly recommend you do it. But here is the summary of what is in the Fallout Bible of Vipers. Their belief system begins with a man named Jonathan Frost, who leads a group of Vault escapees into the wasteland, only to discover a mysterious pit filled with a massive mutated snake. After a series of tragedies, hallucinations, and encounters with these creatures, Frost experiences that he could interpret as divine revelation from the Great Snake, eventually transforming into a prolific figure who leads the survivors into forming the Viper cult. From there, the Vipers develop a full-on religious structure built around venom rituals, sacrifices, and trance-like ceremonies. We see their society is organized into roles like warrior, priest, and ritual specialist, with practices involving controlled venom exposure as a rite of passage. Even their infrastructure reflects the belief system, with locations like the pit serving as a both religious center and execution site. It's one of the most detailed faction backstories in the Fallout Bible entirety. I mean, we get more into it with the Brotherhood of Steel and NCR later on, but because this one was never fully realized, this one is just exceptionally cool. It shows just how far the original design went in to try to make the raiders feel more like cultures and not just random enemies that attacks you. And what's especially interesting is how the Fallout Bible then steps back and clarifies that it isn't considered canon, because obviously regarding the Vipers, because although they're still part of the universe, their final version is simplified and adjusted. Instead of the full cult origin and wandering religious army, they are tied back to just Fallout 15, and their structure becomes less mythic and more grounded in the Wasteland Raider evolution. They're also described as mobile rather than sanctuary, traveling with supplies of mutated snakes and makeshift transportation systems. And more importantly, their history involves major conflicts with the groups like the Hub, that later near extermination of the Brotherhood of Steel, which years later might just explain the hatred between Brotherhood of Steel and Raiders. Beyond the factions themselves, this section also expands on Raiders in general. We're talking about just ones that aren't necessarily part of that three group, but like just random raiders you would just see like on a random encounter. It makes them feel more surprisingly human. It's really cool touches that Chris Avellone added. It makes it clear that raiders just aren't mindless killers. They have families, relationships, belief systems, and raise children. Again, it makes them not just enemies you have in the game. Like it says like, hey, although this isn't shown directly in the game, this is what it's like. Some of these random raider groups have structured hierarchies. Others rely on captured slaves to straighten their numbers, and many adopt religious or naturalistic beliefs to justify their actions. In the Bible, it actually acknowledges the existence of child soldiers in raider culture, reinforcing how deeply normalized violence has become in some of these communities. And finally, this section closes off with a broader grounding of Fallout geography and lore interpretation. It confirms which locations are based on real-world places and which are just fictional creations. We have places like Necropolis, which is obviously based off of Bakersfield in real life, and then Klamath and Reading Reading is named after another location, but Klamath is just another name that they liked, and they just added to it. It also goes into detail about Los Angeles itself, which has been described as being effectively just devastated by bombs, ravaged not just by nuclear fire, but by radiation, disease, famine, and just internal collapse, effectively stating that nothing has really survived out of Los Angeles, and it's probably one of the worst off cities in all of the United States. It's a reminder that even though Fallout is full of structured factions and systems, a lot of the world still comes down to chaos layered over decay, cities rebuilt by people who just aren't as broken as the world they're trying to survive in. The next section, still in Section 6, it goes into detail about what happens to some companions after the events of Fallout 2. Starting out with, for example, we have Skynet, who is left with no confirmed ending at all. The Bible suggests that if we assumed he survived, he likely continued traveling west through the wasteland in search of terminals, databases, and any kind of system he could expand his intelligence in. There's even speculation that he might have reached locations like the Glow, but nothing has ever been confirmed, as said by Chris. Then we moved on to Gorus, and this is where the tones kind of shift differently. The Bible doesn't give a concrete outcome and says he wants to lean into something more poetic, I guess, and far more real. Gorus is described as the last of his kind, a tortured soul, a wandering in a ruined world. There is no destination, there's no resolution. It's kind of just darkness and survival with him, right? It's less of an ending and more of just the final curtain call. Like, that's it with Deathclaws and Intelligent Deathclaws. Again, Chris Avellone extremely hates Intelligent Deathclaws. If he hasn't made it pretty darn clear, he really does not like them and wanted to get them out of the can really fast. Changing from that, we get something that's more grounded but still kind of tragic. What happened to the companion of K9 after Navarro? After being repaired and left in the NCR, K9 ends up caught in a chain of events involving Dr. Henry and NCR authorities. There's paranoia of the Enclave technology fear that K9 represents, and ultimately a decision is to dismantle both K9 and the Cyberdog for study. The result is brutal and simple. K9 is no more. He is disassembled, and it leads to the death. It's just no heroic ending for K9, which sucks because it's a really cute dog. But obviously we see Dr. Henry in Fallout New Vegas, so I guess K9 helped Rex become what he is today because Dr. Henry was able to learn more about it, but I digress. Moving on, we have Zarn, who is not a companion, but he is another Intelligent Deathclaw. Much like Gorus, his fate is left uncertain in the same way. It's intended that he kind of wanders the wasteland. He was supposed to come back and tell the Vault of the coming threat of Frank Horgan, but he is never really seen, or he's not able to come back and tell them anything about it. So again, we don't have much closure about this, and I think, again, Chris Avellone really doesn't like Intelligent Deathclaws, so he definitely brings them out. So I guess the only real good ending we get is of maybe Skynet, but Chris Avellone also does not really like Skynet and makes a lot of notes that, number one, Skynet's not his real name, and that he's just a lying, manipulative AI bot. And it's really interesting which characters Chris Avellone likes, because it is very distinct what he likes and what he does not like. Also in this section, it briefly confirms something that's easy to overlook, but I guess kind of important. Religion has survived the Great War, and we're not just talking about post-world faiths. We're talking about real-world pre-war faiths like Christianity and Mormonism that still exist in the Fallout universe, even if they aren't heavily a feature in the games. The reason they're absent is because, well, they weren't all wiped out. It's because they just don't want to, be featuring a lot of Christianity in the games or stuff like that. But Chris Avellone does make notes that old world religion has survived, and it still exists. At the same time, the Bible also makes note that, some of the darker sides of humanity continued on after the war. Things like racism, sexism, and prejudice still exist in the wasteland. It just kind of been reshaped into new targets, we'll say, like ghouls, supermutants, raiders, and tribals. And one of the more striking examples of this, and is just morally complex, is that of Lynette from Vault City, who is noted as being pro-slavery. despite her position and being educated and high-ranking leader, and she is African American, she is pro-slavery, which is just, it's really interesting, especially because she's educated, because she's from Vault City, so she's got education from a vault, so she knows what happened. It's really interesting, and actually Chris makes a note of it a few times, that he likes that connection that Lynette makes, is the that despise her and her backbringing, she is pro-slavery in Vault City, which is interesting. We also get a quick but interesting ecological note about the oceans. The Bible confirms that aquatic life like fish and seaweed and algae still exist, but beyond that, very little is known. We don't have any confirmation of sightings like sharks and lobsters or more complex marine life that are recorded, as no real research into how radiation or FEV might have affected the ocean ecosystem. It's interesting because, obviously in Fallout 4, in Far Harbor specifically, we see a lot of other creatures that have like ocean creatures. Like we see those weird dolphin things, but we never encountered them like in the actual game. Like they're just objects. But I think it'd be really interesting to see like a water animal actually like in the game. Obviously in Fallout 4, this is just going on a complete tangent note. We had cut content of a kraken being in Fallout 4, specifically whenever, like, I think it was Vault 120 that was cut from the thing. Whatever the underwater vault, it was supposed to be the overseer was that of a kraken or something like that, which would have been really interesting. And of course, we have the ghoul whale that, theories have just rises over, because we have, dialogue going on throughout the game that mentions this ghoul whale. And, there's lots of notes of water creatures, but nothing has ever been really seen, I guess, by the player. So this is a little note that Chris Avellone gave us. And moving on to the next section, we have where Chris Avellone has directly stated he does not like talking Deathclaws. I've made this clear multiple times. That let me just give you some quotes. What he says. He says that all the talking Deathclaws from Fallout 2 were destroyed at the end of the game and are likely gone and probably extinct, and even goes further, stating that any mutated animal capable of speech can be assumed to have died at the exact moment of Fallout 2's conclusion. Like, he makes it perfectly clear. He does not want any talking animals or intelligent Deathclaws in a Fallout game. Yeah, I guess. I mean, we don't really... I think that one Deathclaw in Fallout Tactics, I think, kind of talks. But that was still during like the same time of Fallout 2. So other than that, I don't think we've had any really intelligent or talking beings since then. I'm trying to think. Yeah, no, really. No, that's it. But yeah, no, again, but he made it very clear this section. He does not like intelligent Deathclaws, and they are all wiped out and gone, which sucks because I like my boy Gorus. Moving on to this next section within Section 6 is one of the more interesting parts, in my opinion, where Chris uploads the design documents for the Brotherhood of Steel and NCR factions. That goes into so much detail about it. Like this is honestly my favorite. Section 6 is the best section within the Fallout Bible because there's just so much stuff, and he just uploads directly from like design documents. So we get so much details about, like I said, the Vipers earlier on, and now we're going to the NCR and the Brotherhood of Steel. And actually, he goes into so mumuch detail about a cut location from Fallout 2, the EPA Center, which is so cool. I'm breaking all this stuff down because this is my favorite part of the Bible, honestly. And what we're looking at here is essentially a fully expanded version of what the NCR and the Brotherhood of Steel were meant to be, both, world building wise, and, the universe in general, right? Like, even though you might not see this in the game, this is whatever is supposed to be happening. It even has some like in-universe propaganda at the end, which is super cool. It just shows how complete this society was, like, fleshed out in concept. How the NCR essentially just wasn't a settlement or a faction. It was a rising nation state. It was expanding out of its origins of Shady Sands and just absorbing territory and infrastructure into a political identity across California. At its core, obviously, the NCR is designed as a post-war attempt to rebuild something recognizable. The government structure mirrors that of pre-war United States almost directly, with elected representatives forming a Congress-style system that chooses its leadership positions like president and vice president. And even with that structure, there's internal friction, and different regions using different titles like senators, counselors, or governors, with these distinctions becoming political weapons in themselves. Again, small details, but it's the idea of how the NCRs, rebuilding their civilization. One of the more important figures anchoring all of the NCR together is obviously that of Tandy, who at this point in the timeline has effectively become the symbolic heart to the NCR itself, right? The Bible frames her as almost mythically in some way, especially in the design documents, as someone who's still present since the early days of Shady Sands and Fallout, and who has guided the transformation from that small village into a full republic spanning multiple regions. What's emphasized again and again is her longevity, and how effectively, as long as she is alive, the NCR will be stable and whatnot. It's almost like a saint-like reputation among citizens and even outsiders. And what's really the key idea here is the NCR, isn't just the government. It's almost kind of a personality cult built around the successful governance of Tandy, who's become less of a politician and more of a symbol of what civilization could be if it actually held together long enough to stabilize. And it's actually really interesting because obviously this is in Fallout 2, so this is, I don't think peak NCR, but definitely almost peak NCR. Obviously, it's effectively in design documents, it's stating that Tandy is the glue holding everything together, and not necessarily directly states that when she's gone, it's going to fall apart. But it's interesting because we see that in Fallout New Vegas, where we see the NCR has become more corrupt and is not as good as it once was, and that's because Tandy is obviously gone. The document also goes into the military structure of the NCR, and it gets surprisingly in a good amount of detail, especially for something that is in-game often feels more implied than is fully shown in the game. The NCR maintains one of the largest standing armies in the Wasteland, with organized divisions that includes cavalry, mechanized units, and internal security forces. Among them, the Rangers stand out as an elite, semi-mythologically group operating across the Wasteland from hidden safe houses and, striking at slavers and hostile groups beyond the NCR borders. And this creates an important contrast, right? We have the NCR, who presents himself as lawful and civilized internally, but externally, it's absolutely willing to operate like covert, almost guerrilla-like warfare force when dealing with threats outside of its jurisdiction. And unsurprisingly, this puts them at contrast with conflicts with slaver groups and other raider factions. And even more interestingly is how inclusive the NCR military is, as stated in the design documents, with humans, ghouls, and even supermutants all able to serve within the ranks of the NCR. And, even within the elite units like the Rangers, all of them could serve even up to the Rangers. And for a setting that's shown a lot of prejudice and survival bias, this detail kind of stands out of just so how far the NCR has come in progressive views, I guess, of the Wasteland. Because obviously supermutants and, ghouls are more okay, but supermutants, that's huge that they were allowed in the army. And in fact, getting mild tangent, but in Fallout New Vegas, we were originally supposed to see a supermutant ranger. I forget what his name was going to be, but originally we were supposed to do that, but he was cut as well. But again, to show that, as far back as the Fallout Bible days, that there are other races within the NCR army. There's also a history section that ties everything back to its origin point, that of Vault 15, and the early settlement of Shady Sands. After leaving the Vault environment and forming one of the earliest stable communities in the region, the survivors eventually laid the groundwork for what would become the NCR. And this is where the Fallout Bible just reinforces what's important, that the NCR doesn't emerge from some grand plan. It just kind of grows, from survival at the beginning and, eventually becomes what it is later on. Conflict is unavoidable. The NCR's relationship with Vault 15 and the surrounding territories, describe it as unstable and cynical in nature, shifting between scavenging, settlement creation, and repeat. The final section of the NCR section is a cool propaganda sheet that would be seen in universe. It's like a cell sheet that reads basically like a recruitment brochure, complete with slogans like "We're here, not join us," and just exaggerated promises of safety, and justice, and opportunity. It just lays out the fully owned population numbers, the governance structure, and the citizen pathways, even like a marketing style. Just a good political potential recruiting thing, and it is really cool, and it's on screen now. You can look at it as you will. It's really fun. But yeah, that's the NCR in this document. It's so much fun. It is such a cool document. Moving on to the Brotherhood of Steel. Going in here, it basically defines that the Brotherhood is not just a faction, but it's more of a belief system built around technology. It describes them more as a techno-religious order descended from pre-war military and scientific personnel, people who survived the Great War and then essentially reorganized themselves around the idea that advanced technology is both sacred and dangerous at the same time, which again is really interesting because from the original design documents, they actually mirror what we see in the TV show pretty darn well with Cleric Quintus, I think his name is, a more religious sect of the Brotherhood of Steel, which is interesting. Right away, this creates one of the more important contradictions in the Fallout universe because the Brotherhood is framed as both protectors and gatekeepers of technology, obviously. On one hand, they have absolutely one of the most powerful forces in the Wasteland. Even in small numbers, they have access to pre-war tech like power armor and energy weapons and combat implants. That means they can function at levels far beyond most other factions. The Bible even explicitly states that a squad of Brotherhood Knights could erase an entire town with little resistance, which immediately sets their baseline for a level threat, right? On one hand, they are internally limited in scale, but the Brotherhood isn't meant to be an empire. It's an elite order. It's small and it's selective on who they join. At least it was in the beginning. What the original intention was. It was heavily controlled, and that's where their ideology comes in. The Brotherhood's core belief is that the Wasteland is not responsible enough to handle the advanced technology. In their view, letting the general population freely access pre-war tech would only lead to the repetition of the same mistakes that caused the Great War in the first place. So instead, they collect and store and they keep the technology, sometimes sharing it with select communities like the NCR, and especially in the very beginning, but often keeping the most powerful or dangerous discoveries entirely for themselves. This creates a really important moral ambiguity because depending on how you look at it, the Brotherhood is either stabilizing force, preventing technological collapse, or more like a monopoly, hoarding all this progression for themselves. Like, it's not sharing it with the entirety thing, and they're very selective on who they share it with. And the NCR, they did it very selectively at the beginning, and obviously, as we see in Fallout New Vegas, they or very much ends with each other. And the Fallout Bible doesn't try to resolve that contradiction. It enhances it, right? It states the balance between those two things. Structurally, the Brotherhood is also one of the most organized factions in this setting. Their hierarchy is, militaristic in design, but with religious undertones. Obviously, that reinforces the idea that technology is something sacred. Initiates are the lowest of the low, training under strict conditions before advancing to squires, then knights, and even paladins. And the elite combat arm of the Brotherhood above them sit the elders, who function as both political leadership and long-term strategic oversight. Alongside the military structure exist the scribes, who represent the intellectual and scientific backbone of the organization. While knights and paladins focus on combat enforcement, scribes are responsible for preserving and analyzing the technology, and sometimes even reverse engineering it. They are the reason the Brotherhood doesn't just collect technology, but slowly tries to understand it and then keep it for themselves. Together, these roles form a closed system with, each tier supporting the other and reinforcing the Brotherhood's contained nature. Even the Brotherhood symbol is symbolic and is given the weight in the Bible, which is one of the coolest things I've noticed, because I know what the Brotherhood of Steel logo looks like, but I never knew that there was exact meaning to it. The sword represents the paladins, the gears represents the knights, and the smaller gears represent the scribes and initiates, all functioning under the guidance of the elders, which symbolized by the wings, controlling the movement of the system. And then there's a circle which remains intentionally undefined, almost like the missing piece of the doctrine. Even the Brotherhood itself doesn't fully explain. And that's the coolest freaking thing ever. Like, in the Bible, it literally just lists why the Brotherhood design looks like that. And I'm a big fan of the series, and I've done a lot of ranting on Fallout lore and whatnot. Just take a look at my YouTube channel. And I never knew this. I never knew the reasoning behind it. I thought it was just a cool logo design. And no, there is structural meaning, even though it was never, I don't think it's ever really been defined in game, but this was like the back end reasoning behind it. And this section is just so interesting with the context of everything we know, that is, how it contrasts with the NCR, where the NCR is, more expansive, political, and open ideologically. The Brotherhood is, a small, it's restrictive, and, they contrast each other so well. And it's so interesting how they work together so well in the beginning, and then they kind of just dart off in their own paths later on. It's really cool. Again, highly recommend you at least just read Section 6 if you don't want to read the entire Fallout Bible. Section 6 just has so much meat to it. Speaking of so much meat to it, let's talk about one of the biggest cut locations from Fallout 2 that never made it, but absolutely should have, and that is the Environmental Protection Agency, or EPA. And this place is just peak Fallout weirdness in the best way possible. It is designed as a bonus late game location packed with puzzles and combat encounters and some of the strangest adventure seeds you'll ever hear about. Right off the bat, we have the EPA throws at you a literal jungle growing in the parking lot, filled with spore plants and carnivorous vegetations, setting the tone immediately. It definitely reminds me of the one Vault in Fallout New Vegas, or the spore creatures. Like, that's the kind of vibes it gives off at the beginning. From there, it only gets weirder because there's a petting zoo, in quotes, populated by starving humans, multiple sub-levels filled with poisonous gas and mutated fruit flies, and even a government museum with dioramas about post-apocalyptic America, because of course it is. The facility itself was structured into multiple color-coded levels, red through violet, covering everything from power cores to the biological testing labs, hibernation chambers, and even a top secret gender modification research. It would have used the same clean Vault style tailset from Vault City and Vault 13, which makes the contrast between the sterile pre-war design and the absolute chaos that we find of the EPA Center even better. One of the more interesting parts about this location is how it ties back into gameplay systems and lore of other places, because in here we have full on a vault of storage of seeds that were intended for Arroyo, and some of them have grown into dangerous and outright hostile plants, reinforcing the classic Fallout theme of nothing it's ever as simple as it seems, right? Now, the real magic behind EPA comes from some of its characters, or rather lack of traditional ones. Instead of people, you're dealing with malfunctioning holograms that have essentially gone insane after decades of isolations following the Great War. The holograms are used to be tour guides and administrators, but now they're kind of stuck in an endless bureaucratic loops, arguing with each other because the magnetic fields keep wiping their short-term memory every few minutes. It then leads to one of the best quest concepts I've really ever heard, in which you either fix the systems, interrupt them, or just use brute force your way through the nonsense. And yes, if you want to destroy them, you literally need an EMP grenades to shut down the power cord to break everything. It's so fun. It's so, I love this so much. I wanted to see this so much. I think there are mods to people have used from the design documents. I believe so. Actually, I know so. I've never used it, but I know it exists, and I might have to try just to play with it because it just sounds so fun. And then we got some more levels within the EPA Center to which you can either run your way through toxic gas and try to get your loot really quick, or you have to find a gas mask to survive. There's a ventilation system dungeon crawl to which you're restricted to small weapons while fighting mantises and scorpions and even man-eating plants. And then there's side stories / side characters like the broken hologram that only speaks in static unless you repair it, or Mr. Chemi, a hyperactive drug-making machine that can turn random junk into chems like Radex, Mentats, depending on your skill. It's such a funny thing. And then there's perhaps one of the best and most tragic things that were cut from Fallout 2, and that is a toaster known as the Brave Little Toaster, a sentient appliance with an IQ of 6,000 whose only goal in life is to convince you to make toast. That's it. That's the whole character. And if you actually repair it, it becomes insanely useful, giving you secret codes for safes and caches and other hidden rewards within this location. This character is most likely that of the inspiration of a lot of characters we found in Old World Blues DLC for New Vegas. Just thinking of quite a few different characters that meet this kind of personality of it. In fact, isn't there a freaking toaster? Toaster, Fallout, New Vegas. Yeah, toaster. Yeah, that's what I thought. Like, this is literally. Oh yeah. This literally that is the cut content. That is what this was supposed to be. Because obviously, Fallout New Vegas was made by like almost everyone from Fallout 2 and the original Fallout. So that is what it was going to be. Moving on, there's some deeper cuts in here too. Still within the EPA Center. There's hibernation chambers where you can revive different NPCs depending on your playstyle, or hidden computer entries describing a cure for epilepsy using a coded phrase, something that you can actually use later on in New Reno for a reward. Again, it's a lot of things that are just interconnected, and that would make the EPA just feel so much more of a rewarding, dense location in game. Honestly, this is probably on par with like that of like New Reno in terms of like stuff to do, which is crazy because New Reno is a city. It's easily one of the most important things within Section 6 was this design document. Yeah, the EPA is probably one of the weirdest sandbox. It's not just a dungeon. It's one of the saddest things that it's tragic it never made into the final game, because the EPA Center could have been so freaking cool to add. Moving on to another equally as important revelation in Section 6, finally tackles what the GEC, or the Garden Ishino Creation Kit, was supposed to be. For something that gets treated in game, like in world game, as a miracle device, the Fallout Bible via Chris Avellone makes it very clear that the GEC was never meant to be magic. It was never meant to be a reality-bending, restore civilization instantly button. Instead, it was designed as practically a survival reconstruction toolkit built around an agriculture, infrastructure, and knowledge transfer. At its core, the GEC is described as a system of controlled rebuilding tools. It used fertilizer systems, soil supplements, and a seed library meant to make the barren wasteland capable of supporting agriculture again. Not instantly transforming the world, but seeding the conditions for life to slowly return. Again, it's not supposed to be just instantly fix everything. It's just like over time this will do it. Even the advanced components of the GEC aren't what players might assume at first. With cold fusion as a power source, for example, it isn't meant to transform an entire civilization by itself. It's meant to be repurposed, to be broken down, integrated into the developing settlement as a energy source in the very beginning. In the same way, other components are intended to be dismantled over time and redistributed into a functional infrastructure. Again, it's so weird that you see cold fusion, because obviously it's a big thing that happened in Fallout, the TV show, and again, it's been hanging out the entire time. So instead of a single device that built a utopia, the GEC was to be created more like a starter kit for creating a world again. You don't use it and instantly walk away and have a perfect city. You use it to break apart what you already have, like the vault systems. Like, literally, Chris makes a note that the vaults were intended to be broken apart and rebuilt using the GEC to create your settlement. Like, that was the intention, that you take apart the vault to do this. The GEC uses instructions for dismantling sections of the vault infrastructure and repurposing the machinery and converting pre-war systems into the community tools. In other words, it assumes the vault isn't the endpoint. It's going to be mined for a new society. And that's the most important shift in the interpretation of the GEC. It's not a miracle, it's a manual. It also comes with libraries, holodisk, and encyclopedia knowledge systems, essentially functioning as a condensed survival archive for agriculture, engineering, and reconstruction knowledge. And the so-called replication ability mentioned in the earlier manuals is reframed here as something far more grounded. It's not creating objects from nothing, but enabling systems from within the vault to reconfigure resources or break down existing structures into usable materials. And when earlier Fallout material implies that it can build basic items, what it really means is it can help you restructure existing systems and not generate systems out of thin air. Again, this is all stated within the Bible and everything, and it's really cool because again, so many different depictions of the GEC make it seem like it's just you press a button and society is back, but no, that is actually not how that works at all, apparently. We in game universes, we see groups like the people of Arroyo who treat the GEC as a mythic solution to, the answer to everything and divine answer. But the Bible itself, again, makes it clear that this is a misunderstanding of the tribals, that the GEC is useful, but it's not the miracle machine that the elder from Arroyo is thinking it is, which is hilarious. So the idea of this just being a universal fix for the wasteland is more of just a belief than a reality. And this ties directly into one of the broader themes, again, running through the Bible as a whole, the gap between the wasteland believes in this technology, or the believes they can do something, and to which it can do. And the GEC sits right at the center of this misunderstanding, which is hilarious. Section 7 is dated July 29th of 2002 and is titled The 7 Deadly Secrets, and immediately it sets the tone for one of the more information-dense sections of the entire collection, and is also more revealing about how chaotic and interconnected early Fallout development really was. And it kicks off with one of the biggest surprises in the entire Fallout Bible, and that is with the origins of Deathclaws, which is of course a staple within the Fallout series. For something that feels so naturally Fallout at this point in the series, the Bible reveals what the original concept behind the Deathclaw was, and it wasn't even internally consistent across the development stages. According to the notes attributed by Chris Avellone and the broader of the Fallout design team, the final version of the creatures seen in Fallout and Fallout 2 actually went through multiple conceptual origins before settling into what players recognize today. One version ties them back to Shadow Claws, and that is they would be a lot more hairier as seen on the screen now, and of course that would be seen in more in reference that in Fallout Tactics, where we actually see hairy Deathclaws, and we still get that little bit of the connections. However, more interestingly in my opinion, is the connection back to a game that Interplay was actually working on, and that is a Dungeons and Dragons styled game that was ultimately canceled. And with that, Deathclaws originally got their design look like literally they copied and pasted the old models from the Dungeons & Dragons game, that of a Tarrasque, which is a creature type in Dungeons & Dragons, to which literally they took the design from the Dungeons & Dragons game and just put it in the Fallout game because it was unused. So originally This design from the original Fallout game was quite literally a Jurassic from Fallout, which is hilarious to think about. So instead of it just being a clean, simple design of the Deathclaw, obviously it's a collage of abandoned concepts from multiple projects that eventually merge into what Fallout's most iconic enemy is now seen in the game. And then we also get an unexpected, funny origin story of one of the more stable characters within the Fallout series, and that is of Dogmeat. The companion known as Dogmeat was first introduced in the hub area of the original Fallout, and he was almost given a completely different name during early development. According to the notes in the Fallout Bible, the original proposed name was far less marketable and significantly more crude, being called, quite literally, dog shit, was the original name for Dogmeat. And we have the designer of Scott Benny to thank for this name that was the original design, and we have Tim Kaine to thank for correcting him and having him officially known as Dogmeat later on, because little did you know, Dogmeat was originally going to be called Dog Shit, which I just think is so hilarious and very early Fallout. Now let's move on to one of the strangest cut locations in Fallout 2, and that is the Burrows. Originally, this was a fully planned faction made up of intelligent, mutated raccoon-like creatures escaped from the pre-war SFEF facility near the globe. These creatures were called the Eslander, had formed a functional society split between two different factions: a top dwellers who lived above ground and preserved knowledge, and the den dwellers who embraced a more feral underground existence. They built their settlement into a massive dead tree that they called the Great Tree, which served as a central hub for governance, research, and religion for them. According to the background, the Eslander originally came from experiments tied to the globe. Over time, they lost memory of their original identity as raccoons and began seeing themselves as a newly developed species entirely. They even developed their own language, where the Eslander meant kindred. And for decades, they lived relatively in peace, developing their own hunting skills, culture, and social law, and even created their own rules around violence and exile-based punishment systems. Eventually, as time went on, the society began to fracture as a group of the top dwellers ventures towards the glow, the site of their origin, and then only one returned, with the report of only a message that there are no gods, only death. The single revelation just shatters the community, and the top dwellers begin to question their religion, while the den dwellers double down on the belief to the gods of the glow. This creates a growing ideological divide that threatens to erupt in a full-on civil war between this group of intelligent raccoons. The burrows were also packed with fully written quest lines that never made into the game, obviously. One major quest line was the Search for the Glow, that has the player actually investigating the truth behind the origins of these creatures and deciding whether to validate or destroy their belief system. Another quest, titled The Woodcutter's Wife, involved you kidnapping a mutated survivalist descendant who had gone into madness due to isolation. And then there's To Catch a Wisp, where children began disappearing, leading the player into a chain of investigations involving raiders, caravans, and even a traveling circus owner inspired by P.T. Barnum. Depending on the player actions, the burrow could become a loyal allied settlement, a fractured civil war zone, or a destroyed faction completely wiped out. And it's one of the more complex locations that we could have been to or seen in the Fallout games, especially the earlier ones. And importantly, in the Fallout Bible, it makes it clear that this content represents an early design intent and not obviously the final canonization. And it, obviously it was cut and never put into the game. I think the main idea behind it was because it didn't feel very Fallout-y, this group of intelligent, I guess more sentient animals. And I have to agree, although it sounds really cool to add, it really doesn't sound Fallout-y, especially the early game Fallout. It doesn't sound like it. However, as I've noted, and I've mentioned this before on the channel, these creatures are still kind of canon in the game, because due to one holodisk entry that mentions this race of intelligent raccoons. So technically, it according to the original Fallout and one holotape that's still in the game, it makes note of this group of intelligent raccoons effectively leaving and going out into the wasteland. So although we don't necessarily have this race, like all this lore behind them. Like, technically, FEV infected raccoons are still a thing. Section 8 from October 2002 opens with a discussion around Fallout's early on pen and paper roots, specifically the idea of a Fallout tabletop RPG and whether creators could get into a legal trouble for publishing their own interpretations of the system. It's a really interesting early glimpse onto how Fallout wasn't really being treated as a video game setting, but more of something that could potentially exist across multiple platforms. It also raises a fun modern parallel, especially considering later systems like the Fallout 2D20 tabletop RPG system, and even earlier unofficial attempts at adapting a world into a pen and paper form. This actually gives me an idea, is I know Chris Avellone made a version of Fallout pen and paper, early on, I think before Bethesda acquired it. And I want to know if anyone would be interested in me taking a look at it. Obviously I play the Fallout 2 D20 system, to which you can see our Dungeons and Deathclaws series that's on this channel / on another channel that I have. And I wanted to know, is this something you guys would be interested in me in going to a deep dive about it? Because obviously I have my own thoughts about the Fallout 2 D20 system. That's a whole separate debate and rant on its own system, but I've never personally looked into the pen and paper system that Chris Avellone developed, so I don't know. I think if no one else is interested, I might just read through it and make a short video sharing my thoughts about it and how it compares to the new system we have. This section also shifts into an interview with the developer of Scott Beanie, who played a larger role in the early development. Beanie worked on areas like the hub, Dogmeat obviously, the upper sections of the cathedral, and is also credited with creating the mysterious stranger perk. According to him, some of the Fallout's early quest design was much more reactive and flexible, and that made it into the final version of the game. For example, he gives in that Iguana Bob, who at one point could have been blackmailed by the player instead of simply being handed in to the police at the hub, a more straightforward questline resolution. From there, the discussion moves on to one of Fallout's more persistent world-building questions, and that's horses. In the game, horses are obviously completely absent from the entire series, which has led to years of speculations about whether they survived the Great War or not, or are simply just removed due to gameplay and engine limitations. In this section of the Fallout Bible, Avellone states more directly that horses are extinct in the Fallout universe. However, the explanation isn't entirely absolute, as mules are suggested to still exist in some capacity, according to Avellone, while Brahmin have clearly taken over as the dominant livestock replacement across the wasteland. Obviously, it's one of those lower points that different sources and different media interpretations, don't always line up perfectly. Obviously, the Fallout Bible isn't considered canon, as Bethesda picks and chooses what they want to take from it. And horses, we are kind of still in the air if they're extinct or not, because obviously we had the All Road, I think, whatever the comic series that came out right before New Vegas, I think All Road comic, and that had horses during the massacre of Bitter Springs. Yeah, Massacre of Bitter Springs. They had horses in the comic, and obviously horses haven't been seen any other time except that comic series, and in fact the only other note we have of horses is in the Fallout Bible, to which everyone says they're extinct. So horses are still so in the air if it's true or not. And now again, that brings up another question: would you be interested in me looking into this this comic? I mean, it's a really cool comic, and there's a lot of cool things. It's basically right before the events of Fallout New Vegas, and I plan on going into not a deep dive, because I don't think there's enough content for me to make a full super long video about it, but probably a decent amount of time for me to rant through it. But let me know if you're interested in me going into a deeper dive of the All Roads comic series. And as of note, I believe it was Todd Howard who made a note that the only reason horses aren't in Fallout, at least like Bethesda's versions, is because of in-game restraints and gameplay limitations, and obviously having to shift the creativity, which I feel like is the worst excuse ever, because we have horses in Skyrim and Oblivion, so just put it over. I don't know, I'm just making excuses at this point. Moving on, the Bible has these really cool early draft pictures that I figured I wanted to show you guys. So obviously we have the Lancray, or whatever, the intelligent raccoon race, the Recray, and that of early Con armor that I just thought is super cool. I wanted to add. Again, these are like super rough sketches that they had, and you most likely have seen these pictures like looming around. Although I never saw this Con armor before one, which I thought was really cool. But again, I just want to add all this stuff. And then finally, Section 9, spanning that of October 15th to November 6th, 2002. It starts off with somewhat something that honestly caught me off guard, and that is Brahmin. Because, like most people, I always assumed Brahmin was just your standard mutated dairy cows, the most common, like, cows you see across America as an American, right? It's just what I would think of whenever, Brahmin, are a cow. However, according to the Fallout Bible, Brahmin are specifically based on the real breed of cattle from India, that of, quite literally, Brahmin. Like, I knew Brahmin was a type of cow. However, I never knew that it was legit that type of cow that was the one that was mutated. Like, I don't know why, I just never made the connection. I just thought it was always just a regular cow. And I guess in the grand scheme of things, it doesn't make a lot of difference in my, like, mind-blown thought. But I just think it's really interesting that all these two-headed Brahmin, the cows that we see in all of Fallout, are mutated descendants of this specific breed of cow from India, which I just think is super interesting, because again, I didn't necessarily know that. Like, my head just never made that connection. From there, let's move on to Myron, everyone's favorite, or accurately least favorite companion from Fallout 2, and more importantly, the ongoing mess of Jet lore. So in Fallout 2, we're told very clearly that Myron is a 20-year-old, or close to it, a chemist who invented Jet, the chem that helped fuel the spread across places like New Reno. And that's been understanding for years. But then later entries in the series, most notably in like Fallout 4, show existence of Jet in places like pre-war sealed vaults that should be impossible for Myron's invented Jet to have been in place and been created. And in fact, I believe there's also terminal entries that make note of Jet, like pre-war. So the thing is, this is the thing I want to poke on, is that even as early as Fallout 2, Jet lore was also up in the air. There's a line of dialogue from Mrs. Bishop being addicted to chem as a teenager, which would have been at least a decade before the events of Fallout 2, meaning before Myron would be even capable of inventing Jet. And according to the Bible, Chris Avellone talks about this and makes a note about this, with the idea that he does say that Myron did invent Jet, and any conflicting information like the Bishop timeline is essentially meant to be ignored and isn't true. So, does this full fix the inconsistencies that we see throughout the Fallout franchise? Not really. However, during the events of Fallout 2, it is clear of why it's in there. I mean, obviously, we don't see Jet in the original Fallout because it wasn't that far in the timeline, and Jet wasn't even invented at this point. So that's why we don't see it in the original Fallout. And I mean, we could like say this thing as just an oversight to developers again, that Jet was a pre-war drug. I don't know. The Jet is such like a hot debate of what it is, and it raises so many like, not flags, but so many banners of people, like Fallout fans, of like what their debated and like headcanon is. And it's really interesting. I just wanted to point out the fact that this has been a hot debate even since the early conception of Fallout, the early conception of this chem, as even as simple as Fallout 2 got it completely wrong. Next up is another character that no player has ever encountered at all in Fallout 2, and that is of Kaga. Kaga was designed as a rival to that of the Chosen One, with a really interesting concept behind him. And that was the idea that the Chosen One wasn't actually the first person to be sent out from Arroyo to complete the GEC mission and Kaga was sent at one point. Throughout the game, Kaga would ambush the player on multiple different occasions, each encounter showing him getting progressively stronger, just like the player, mirroring the player actually. Better armor, better weapons, more health, literally evolving inside the player. Each fight would end up with Kaga retreating and saying, I'll get you next time. And this would eventually lead up to the final encounter, where it becomes the fight to the death. It's a really cool idea, and it adds a personal antagonist in Fallout 2. But like a lot of things in the Bible, it didn't fully make it into the final experience of the game. And honestly, I kind of like that they didn't add it fully into the game, because it ruins the idea that the Chosen One is the sole Chosen One, and the idea that there are multiple other Chosen Ones, in quote. And it kind of defeats, I guess, more of the prestige of what your character is in the village, if they're just sending out other people before you. And this is kind of it. The rest of Section 9 mostly dives into smaller details, bug explanations, minor development notes, and some light interview content, but nothing really as impactful as what we've already covered, and nothing really of note. And from there, the Fallout Bible just ends. There's no grand conclusion, no final message, just more of the same things that we've covered throughout the entirety of the video, or that was put in the earlier documents, that of same Q&A style entries, and is written almost like it was expecting to continue the series, but it never did. Obviously, with the decline of Interplay and Chris Avellone actually leaving the company shortly afterwards, Section 10 never happened, and the Fallout Bible simply stopped mid-thought, and there was no real closure to it. Obviously, not long after that, the rights to Fallout would eventually be sold to Bethesda Softworks, after making it the end of the era of the Fallout Bible. There's actually a forum post from 2002 on No Mutants Allowed that sums this up perfectly, with the users saying that with the fall of Interplay and the original author gone of Chris Avellone, the chances of any new entries are basically non-existent. And just like that, the Fallout Bible became pretty much exactly what it is today. Not a final document, but a snapshot of Fallout's developmental history, frozen in time. As one user wrote, "But I was wondering if there was any further word on issue 9. Is 9 going to be the last issue of the Fallout Bible?" To which another user responded, "Let's see, if MCA is at another company," meaning Chris Avellone, Fallout is owned by Bethesda, Interplay Studios is dying, so yes, unless Bethesda wants to make the Bible, it's dead." Which is sad, because the Fallout Bible, actually reading through all of this, it was so fun. Having a developer go through and just tidying up lore pieces is so fun. And I think, although we don't get anything more official, I think Emil Pedrigo, as much as people give him shit about random lore pieces that he puts on his Twitter page, I think he is probably the closest thing we would get to a revival of the Fallout Bible, essentially. He posts random things to Twitter about, he randomly answers questions or does Q&A and lore updates. And I think if we had to find someone to continue the legacy that was the Fallout Bible that came out over 20 years ago, which is crazy, he would be the mantle. He would be the one to hand the torch off to. Unfortunately, I don't foresee this happening ever again, but obviously this was just a statement in time, and it's so cool. So in the end, the Fallout Bible clocks in around 254 pages in Adobe Acrobat, and I have to say, it's honestly one of the funniest and most interesting reads if you're a Fallout fan. More than anything, it gives you a completely different vibe of what the Fallout community was like back in the day, in the original days. People were literally just emailing Chris Avellone random questions, and he would respond to almost anything. Some of the comments and questions were straight up ridiculous at times and just dumb, of something you could literally find out by playing the game, but he still engages with them, and it really speaks to early internet era. Getting to see the original design documents of cut locations, early faction ideas, and all of the what could have been content, It's easily one of the coolest parts of the Bible. It really shows how much thought and creativity went into building the world of Fallout. The Bible as a whole just proves how much love and care the original developers had for the series. Of course, Fallout was a passion project in the beginning. It genuinely feels like it was, and it's not just a piece of documentation. And with it being written by Chris Avellone, you get his signature tone the entire way through, being super sarcastic, brutally honest, and not afraid to share his actual opinions, especially when it comes to things like the removal of intelligent death claws and other intelligent creatures. And you can tell exactly how he feels about it. I would highly recommend any Fallout fan take the time to read through it at least once, because there is so much interesting stuff packed into it. And although I have to say my biggest question of all this is, why did no one really ask about psychers? Like, we have this little bit section in, I think, like the first or second entry, and it's one of the biggest missed opportunities out there, because we'll probably never get any more information about psychers, except, I mean, total tangent, I think Fallout 2 D20 system is creating they're creating like new setting guides to which they're going to be adding psychers, which I think this is probably the most information we'll get about psychers in the past 20 years, and I'm so excited about that, because psychers are the coolest freaking thing ever, and I'm so excited to dive into that. Anyway, if you enjoyed this and want more Fallout lore content like this, be sure to subscribe, because I've got a lot of things planned in the coming months that you don't want to miss out. If you want to support the channel while picking up some Bethesda merch, of course, use that code that's pinned at the top of the comments for 20% off. And if you really like the video, consider becoming a channel member if you want to do so. But until then, this has been Nick from Nostalgic, signing off.